Welcome to Once Lost Ministries. We want to encourage the Christian to reach out to where we once were. Today, we're going to talk about Pokemon. Flynn, why does Pokemon matter?
Pokemon matters, man, because it is a huge marketing tool, and we're going to try to make the case for it to be a marketing tool of the enemy. So it's got a message for sure, and there are tons and tons of kids and grown-ups that are very interested in it. So we want to talk about it today and challenge listeners, challenge viewers that maybe grew up on Pokemon to rethink, re-examine in light of Scripture the challenges that Pokemon brings to the table all on its own.
We're going to start with Proverbs 4 in verse 19 and then read through there to kind of set the tone of the conversation. It says, "The way of the wicked is as darkness. They know not at what they stumble. My son, attend to my words and incline thine ear unto my sayings. Let them not depart from your eyes. Keep them in the midst of thine heart. For they are life unto those that find them, and health to their flesh. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Put away from thee a froward mouth, and perverse lips put far from thee. Let thine eyes look right on, and let thine eyelids look straight before thee. Ponder the path of thy feet, and let all thy ways be established. Turn not to the right hand nor to the left, and remove thy foot from evil."
Right. So the challenge we're going to give today is for that person that two people, I think. Number one is the person who maybe has played Pokemon in the past, is somewhat familiar with it, and it's just maybe something that they think is okay and they're fine with it. We are going to lovingly try to challenge that idea. And I hope that people are blessed by that challenge. The other person is maybe you're a parent or a grandparent and your child is really into Pokemon and you don't know a lot about it. So our challenge is going to be, we're going to give you some information so that you can go study it a little bit further. And that way, when you go and talk to your child, you can talk with information, with knowledge, to help them not just not do something, but really know what's wrong, unbiblical, dangerous, deceptive. And we don't use those words lightly. We're not trying to just garner views with those kind of words. This is really something that comes from a dark place. So here's my first question. So I'm going to throw this out there to the viewers and to you, Kyle. So we've got a lot of different franchises in the world today, especially for kids. And, franchises know they make tons of money with it. So you've got Barbie, you've got Marvel, you've got Star Wars, you've got all kinds of them. Mickey Mouse and Friends. What was the other one I looked up? It was Hello Kitty. That's right. So, and for the viewers, I might be looking down from time to time because I want to make sure that I get the quotes right. I want to make sure that everything is good that I'm saying and not misspeaking. So if I look down, that's why I'm looking down. But you've got all these different franchises. And let me ask you this. Where do you think Pokemon ranks along money-wise with the franchises of today, the Hello Kitties, the Marvels, the Star Warses? Do you think third, fourth? And the answer is first. Pokemon ranks number one above Mickey and Friends. It ranks number one above Marvel, number one above Star Wars by tons. So Marvel's total amount of gross on their franchise that I found was $35 billion. That's a ton of money. But Pokemon is actually currently at $100 billion in their marketing franchise. And so they have the largest franchise for kids to date. And they've only been around for 25 years. Or around 25 years. So you go, okay, well, this franchise that was built around 25 years ago, 1996, they are building an absolute behemoth. And the COO of Pokemon actually said, he was quoted to say that he wants to see Pokemon not be around for tens of years, but hundreds of years. Now that's some real forethought that has to go into place to make sure that marketing continues. And they have. One of the reasons we're doing this video is way back in like the early 2000s. Well, actually the late 1990s, when I got saved, I was working with kids that were absolutely obsessed with Pokemon. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's a fad. And, that's how it works. Franchises come and go, but certain ones stay. And during that time, there was Pokemon, Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh! And those are still somewhat around, the other ones. But Pokemon clearly is a front runner. And not only a front runner, it is the front runner. So that's why, again, we're talking about these things, because with a franchise like that, a powerhouse like that, it is by no accident that it is the way it is. They have purposely set it out to be that way, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But just for people, for knowledge sake, Pokemon is actually broken up into three categories. You have the Game Freak, you've got Nintendo, and you've got Creatures. Those are the three groups that own Pokemon. So it's they've actually diversified how the franchise works, which is kind of a rare thing. That doesn't always, most of the time, that doesn't happen. So for the listeners and viewers, Game Freak goes ahead, and they are the ones who develop the card designs for Pokemon. Nintendo does the video games, and Creatures manages the trading card games. And for those who maybe don't know, Pokemon has several different areas that it reaches people with. It's got the trading cards. It's also got the video games. It's got the movies. It's got the TV shows. It's got the magazines. It's got also, it's got the not just the trading cards, but it's also got the card playing, the role playing games that you can do with it. And that's an area that we'll discuss in just a little bit. So keep that in mind when we're talking today. We're not just trying to pick on some little topic that a few people are into, but this is something that is really changed culture and the way that they think. I mean, if I say Pikachu, immediately you should be thinking little yellow creature that shoots lightning bolts and says Pikachu, right? I mean, it's just very common to see it everywhere. And you see it on kids' t-shirts, you see it on McDonald's Happy Meals, you see it everywhere. And if in your mind you're thinking cute, cuddly creatures that just kind of are fun activity things and stuff, plushies and stuff that kids buy, then they've done their job. They've actually done their job to fool people into thinking that's what Pokemon is. That's not what Pokemon is. So that's what we're going to try to do today, is strip back some of the layers so you can see what's really going on. You know, Satan masquerades as an angel of light. He just does. And it says how much more his minister, or how much more, you know, the angels ministering spirits of righteousness, or at least appearing to. And so Satan has a message. He has a direction that he wants to go with things. And he oftentimes doesn't use wickedness to, you know, promote a message, especially to kids, right? If I'm going to teach a lie, my goal isn't to try to scare kids immediately. My goal is to draw them in with cute, cuddly things that just look fun and offer a little bit of, fulfillment or excitement, or maybe a little bit of escapism. And then from there, you bring them in and you start teaching them all the stuff. And that's exactly what Pokemon does. Like, I was watching last night, the first episode ever, I Choose You. And in that cartoon, Ash actually is a 10-year-old. That's really where the storyline kind of got introduced to kids back in the, late 1990s or mid 1990s. But Ash is a 10-year-old who is in this town, and there's Pokemon. When you turn 10, you can start to become a Pokemon trainer. So once you become a trainer, then you take your Pokemon and you begin to capture all these other Pokemon. And then you become better and better and grow and grow. And that's an area where, Pokemon just literally has such a crafty, creative message, because the kids are growing with Ash, right? You can tell where they're trying to help kids draw them in, because they're starting with a 10-year-old, not a 2-year-old, not a 20-year-old, but a 10-year-old. And he's learning to become a Pokemon trainer. It's very similar to what happened with J.K. Rowling's books. You've got a kid who's learning to become a sorcerer, and he's going to the school to become a sorcerer, then that's what all of the readers are going to identify with, or all the viewers. So when you have Harry Potter going in and saying, "Oh, Harry, you're one of the chosen ones. You come to our school at Hogwarts," it's similar here, but just a little even less. It's less dark. It's less diabolical. It's just fun. The music is fun. It's catchy. The colors are bright and colorful, and everything seems very harmless. And that's why I think people stumble as we talk about this. I know, Kyle, you got into that conversation recently and with some people, and people do stumble at Pokemon. They think you're kind of crazy bringing it up, but what we want to do is present today, and this is a little different format. It's not going to be just a conversation between Kyle and myself. I'm just going to try to do essentially a large information share with everybody that's watching and listening. And obviously Kyle will be interjecting from time to time. But not only money wise, okay, so you think about the conglomerate of Pokemon, you've got $100 billion in their franchise. They have this, you have the CEO or COO wanting Pokemon to be around for hundreds of years, which, if the Lord tarries, probably will be the case. They have strategically marketed their materials so that will happen. They reach the next generation. So we're on like about the third generation or second generation of people. The kids who grew up on Pokemon are now the young adults who are now having kids and sharing Pokemon. So that you have this new generation that's being introduced to Pokemon very intentionally. They have remarketing of their video games so that a new generation can learn them and practice them. And then the role-playing cards, which, we're familiar with the collectibles. So a lot of us know that kids like to collect the cards, which, causes a lot of problems just in scams and other things that happened over the years. Kids beating each other up, kids getting angry. There was actually a kid stabbed at one point, and I'm sure more than one, but the one article I read, the kid got stabbed for a card. And we're talking 9-year-olds. So you think, okay, well, clearly they have developed the hype they wanted in this. I'm not saying they intended for all that to happen, but they have clearly pushed the marketing message very, very carefully, very intentionally. And one of the stats I pulled up for the trading card section of Pokemon, which they call, would be the TCG, the trading card game, there are over 15 billion trading cards printed as of when I pulled up the article. So you think, okay, this company that has 15 billion trading cards. It's also got the collectible cards. It's also got the movie, which, is pretty popular, but not necessarily like the giant box office hit or anything. But you've got the movies out there. You've got the TV show out there. You've got the video games, which when I tallied up the total in the video games, it was, there's a image I found that went through and broke down all the major video games. Anyway, not all. I don't think it has all the spin-offs, but the major video games and the amount purchased. If you add up all of the purchases, it's like 15 billion purchases of their video games. So you talk about the amount of money they have just from a strictly franchise perspective, marketing perspective. They have done a great job with all of that. They actually have a new, I don't know when we'll be launching this video wise, but I'm hoping we're hoping it obviously is before 2025, but they are actually pushing out a new box card set called Prismatic Evolution. And that's actually supposed to come out, I think, if I remember right, around January 15th. And that just was announced recently. And the Prismatic Evolution set sold out. The pre-sale sold out in about 10 hours. So the draw or the desire for Pokemon obviously has not gone away. And I was reading some of the Reddit articles of people commenting saying, my kid is just obsessed with it. And these were recent articles. So it's not just something that happened 10, 15 years ago. And I have a class right now where a lot of them were really, I would say, obsessed with it. Last year, before they were in my class, they were bringing their trading cards, and they had books binders this thick of trading cards that were just filled with these Pokemon characters. And you just think, just the money spent is amazing alone, let alone the message behind it. And that's what we're really going to talk about for the remainder of this. I just wanted people to understand we're not talking about something little, just some little, pet project or pet issue we have because I work with students, or, Kyle, you have 5 girls. And so we're just picking on some little project. That's, issue. That's not the goal at all. The goal is to say, look, this is going to be around a while. We need to know how to converse. Part of our channel is to go and talk to people and share the gospel, right? So our encouragement is you need to go with knowledge. Go with an understanding of the God's word first and foremost, but also what what's going on in the culture. And for those that are watching that are maybe teachers at youth group, volunteers at youth group, I will guarantee if you want to have a good conversation with your kids, bring up Pokemon. Bring it up, because we shouldn't be afraid to have the conversations. And unless you know something about it, you're not going to be able to swing it back. And that's what I do in the classroom is we'll bring these things up, and then I can swing it back to talking about Genesis 3, how the lie came in from Satan. What is that lie? What is the goal of Pokemon? And after about 10, 15 minutes of conversation, you can see it on the kids' faces. They're realizing, wait, there's a lot more to this than I realized. So, and I just want to quote there. I'm going to give a couple quotes from Barrett Chose. Her name looks like Berit, Berit. She's a Christian. She's done a lot of good research with Pokemon, and her last name is KJOS. Her ministry is crossroad.to, I think, or crossroads plural.to. And she does a good job researching a lot of these areas. She wrote a really good book in the 90s called Brave New Schools, examining all the dangers that were going on and still are going on with transcendental meditation in the schools, yoga, et cetera, et cetera. But she wrote this regarding Pokemon a while back. She said, marketing a new lifestyle, the Pokemon mania supports a financial conglomerate that knows how to feed the frenzy. The television series is free, but it drives the multi-billion-dollar business. It also inspires obsessive new games that disrupt schools and families by giving the children what they want. And these are a few points of what it gives them. She says, a seductive vision to become a Pokemon master, a tempting promise, supernatural power, a new objective, keep collecting Pokemon, an urgent command, got to catch them all. And this is really, if you think about the message of what Pokemon is, it's not just some kid who's trying to collect these cute little creatures. It's a kid who's going on a quest that's never ending. And it just is a rabbit hole. It just goes deeper and deeper. He's got to collect them all. Well, when Pokemon started in 1996, there were 150 Pokemon. As of today, there's over 1,000 of them. And I'm sure they'll just keep going because marketing, right? It's just great to keep it going. So if you're training kids to be trainers, which really what you're doing as a marketing ploy is you're training the kids to keep chasing after the Pokemon. Well, just from a franchise perspective, that's wonderful because you can just keep it going. And once these kids are trained to do that, they'll just keep doing it, right? We had Pokemon Go in 2016 that came out, literally was just blew off the charts when it came to the amount of people that were on this augmented reality game from Pokemon. All kinds of issues were happening with it. It's still popular. There's over 500 million people that are still on the platform. And I think 500,000. I apologize. I think 500,000 people that are still on the platform. And so that's another piece of their puzzle. And they just want you to keep going. And in an article that I wrote back in like 2016, and we also did a previous video on Pokemon Go right after it got launched. I think it was July 16th, 2016. But we did an article about that, a video article, and I did a written article. But the title was Pokemon Go, Where Is It Taking You? And that, I think, intentionally is what we need to be wondering. We read specifically Proverbs 4, consider your feet, consider your path carefully. And for the believer that's out there, I really want you to listen carefully to the things we talk about. Don't shut your mind off just because this is something nostalgic for you or something that you think is innocent or harmless. And for the pastor maybe that's listening, I challenge any pastor to, once we're done explaining this stuff, to try to biblically support why you think it's okay to allow Pokemon, its trading cards, its message to be allowed or supported. It's just, we're not saying that we need to be legalistic and shut everything down and walk around, in sackcloth and just basically be monks. That's not what we're saying with this message at all. But there are some things that have a message that is deadly, and we are just complacent with our children. We're happy to teach them the Bible on Wednesday night and then let them go continue to collect their cards and play Pokemon Go and other things that are dangerous. And so that's, again, why we're talking about what we're talking about. So At this point, I think I want to kind of pause on the conglomerate discussion and talk about some of its history. So I think we've made a good enough point for why it's such a big deal and how it's going to continue to be a big deal. So that's kind of the money talk and somewhat of the first discussion point we're going to go through. But then it's history.
Before we get into history, Flynn, the one thing that keeps coming to my mind as you're talking, and when people have this discussion, the word amusement or enjoyment usually comes into play, because most often a lot of Western society, now we're going to get into the history and the roots of the Japanese culture, but in general, we are in America right now where this video is being recorded, and a lot of people are just using this tool, this resource as of entertainment, as a way to experience their type of joy. In today's society, and amusement usually refers to activities of entertainment, or often with the intent of giving a mental break. But the etymology of the actual word amuse is actually to divert the attention, or to beguile, or to delude. Now, that's
Yes.
not what our culture actually captivates. That they actually use it as a form of trying to find joy. That's why they usually say enjoyment with amusement. But the word amuse means to not think, muse. And
Yep.
interesting enough, there's Greek gods at the time that were called muses, and they were distractions. They were the art form that were using a way to beguile and lead people into a spiritual entertainment. And I think that's exactly where our Western culture is today. I wanted to quote Philippians 4:8. It says, "Finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, and whatsoever things are just, whatever things are pure, and whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things." And
Yep.
so God encourages us to use our minds. He's encouraging us to think. And I know after a heavy, long day, most of us want to just shut it down. But that's not the biblical way or approach to find rest. He says, put your rest in Jesus. Put
Right.
your yoke upon him. His burden is light. And so he calls us to continually chew and meditate, not in an emptying of mind, which is what we're going to get into a little bit with what this culture of Pokemon does. But we want to ponder and think on these things, and encourage our children to think as well, because we are constantly raising up a generation of not thinking about anything, let alone
Right.
biblical.
No, you're exactly right. And amusement, is there a time to, just kind of chill out and be entertained? Sure. But be careful what you're being entertained with, because we talked about this with our occult series. If you take the word entertainment out and put doctrine in, there is a lot of doctrine. There are a lot of doctrines that are pushed under the guise of entertainment. And music is tremendously powerful. And that is one of the biggest ones. And we've had that conversation often. And with Pokemon, there are three pieces that really cause people to keep coming back to it. And one is the entertainment value, the amusement value of it. The other one is the nostalgia of it. And the third one has to do with the activity of it. And then there is a spiritual component. So I guess we could say the fourth one for some people, I was reading some people's comments, and they understood exactly what Pokemon was trying to purport as its message. And they were excited about it. So I guess those would be the four areas of it. So the amusement of it, and the activity of it, the nostalgia of it, and the spiritual message for some people is something they want. Now, it's interesting that people in the world can recognize it's got a spiritual message, but the Christians sometimes, sadly, we are kind of like sheep. We just don't recognize, for whatever reason. I don't understand why, but for whatever reason, we just don't seem um, to realize that certain things really are dangerous. They have a spiritually deceptive message to them. And Pokemon is huge in this area. And you might still be thinking, if you're still with us, still be thinking, come on, guys, I don't believe it. So stick with us. I really do. Not to just keep you on this video, but stick with us. We are going to go through some stuff that hopefully really challenges. When I was reading through it, it made me sick. I had to stop listening to it yesterday. I was listening to several things and reading several things, and I was getting sick to my stomach, and just I had to turn it off for a while and go do something else because it was gross to keep reading it. And it's, that's just what it is. So you're right, the amusement of it. And interestingly, I was reading an article in Time Magazine, and one of the ones they put out, because Pokemon has made their whole magazine. They did one on Dungeons and Dragons. They also did one on Pokemon, which both are role playing games, which I'm going to bring up. But they talked about the nostalgia. Nostalgia, actually, when you break down the meaning, the roots of of the word, it actually means homesick. So nostalgia actually means wanting to go home, feeling the pain of that. So like if you go off to camp when you're a kid and I can't wait to get home, and just you feel that sickness in the pit of your stomach. And that's really what nostalgia is. And for people who grew up with Pokemon, that's why when Pokemon Go came out, they went back to the original 150 Pokemon. They went back to draw out the nostalgia of the original game for the people playing. Because look, if you're 10 years old in 1996, you're 20 in 2016. So if you're 6 years old in 2006, there are plenty of 4 to 6 year olds playing Pokemon, in 2006, right? And so it was just top of the game. So now you're 16, and so you have a cell phone, and they knew what they were doing. So they weren't dumb. That was the 20-year anniversary of Pokemon when Pokemon Go came out. And that was very intentional. And they drew on nostalgia and entertainment and everything else. So yes, exactly right, Kyle. Thank you for bringing that up. So, and we're going to actually talk about, is a game just a game? So we'll touch on some of these points as we go through the discussion today.
Cool. Let's get into the history.
All right, history. So Pokemon was developed by Satoshi Tajiri and originally released to the Game Boy, Nintendo's Game Boy, in 1996. And this is where I'm going to start to build the case for the dangers of Pokemon. So if you think about Satoshi Tajiri, he's from Japan. And if you think about Japan, you have to know that Japan has a lot of animistic, shamanistic, Shintoistic beliefs. So Shintoism is actually the largest, or back, maybe about 10 years ago, there were about 70% of people recognized practicing Shintoism in Japan. Now that's decreased quite a little bit over time. There's a lot of like non-practicing Shintos, but they're still very animistic. They're very spiritual. They just don't identify specifically to a religion anymore, which is the same thing that's happening in every culture, it seems like, or most anyway. So you've got this guy who grew up in Japan with a heavily influenced culture of Shintoism, shamanism, animism. It's their day-to-day life. So you have to keep that in mind. I don't think you can divorce that from the way he developed Pokemon. Another thing I wrote down was that Pokemon means, for those who might not know, pocket monster. Now, you might not think that that's a big deal because obviously we have Monsters Inc. and other movies that make monsters fun and friendly and cuddly. But the reality is, when you think of a monster, we really shouldn't be thinking of something good. So Pokemon actually transliterates to pocket monster. So you've got pocket monster, which I'll be referring to more as, I'll either be talking about them as mystical monsters or pocket monsters throughout the rest of our conversation most of the time, but I'll say Pokemon too. And here's a connection that, as I was doing research, and people are welcome to check me out on this, but more than one site that I looked at that were reputable go-to sites for Pokemon information, because there's just so much information that you need to know about how to battle, how to play in the games and stuff. There are sites dedicated and devoted to just tons and tons of information on these Pokemon, their levels, their XP, their abilities. It's overwhelming. But several of these sites connected that Pokemon may also have been influenced by something that's very heavily saturated into Japanese culture, especially ancient Japanese culture, but also today. They're called yokai, which are special creatures in Japanese folklore with strange abilities, sometimes even created from inanimate objects. So as we're talking about this subject of Pokemon, quite a few people that aren't even Christians have said, look, Pokemon are essentially these yokai. Now, if you research yokai at all, they are not something biblical at all. So I'm going to say that as we're talking about all of this, keep in mind also that the animist culture inside of Japan is heavily, animism is kind of like the word animation. So animism means there's life in everything, which is kind of another idea of pantheism. But there's life inside of the rocks, the trees. And if you look at Pokemon, pocket monsters, you'll notice that a lot of them look like trees or creatures or other things that some are usually inanimate, like a rock. But Pokemon, because someone like anybody from Japan, but if you look at like Tajiri, he started from as a kid understanding if I look at a bug, I'm not just looking at a bug, I'm looking at this living creature that might have a story behind it, and there's life in there. If I'm looking at a rock, there's life in there. So when he's developing these things, he's developing them from an animistic perspective. So it's not just a fun cartoon where you have rocks that are talking. They actually believe these things, that there's life that you can either tap into, that you need to respect. That's a lot of what the Mother Earth and the whole saving the Earth idea is kind of tied into. But I'm going to read a little bit really quick. And this is from Wikipedia, which, take it for a bit of grain of salt, but they actually have done a lot better over the research because they want to stay on the forefront. So they do a good job quality checking, much more than they used to. But I'm going to just read this just for clarity. So yokai, which means strange apparition, are a class of supernatural entities and spirits in Japanese folklore. The kanji representation of the word yokai comprises two characters that both mean suspicious and doubtful. Yokai are typically described as having spiritual or supernatural abilities, with shape-shifting being the most common trait associated with them. The concept of yokai, their causes and phenomenon related to them, varies greatly throughout Japanese culture and historical periods. Typically, the older the time period, the higher the number of phenomena deemed to be supernatural in result of yokai. According to Japanese ideas of animism, spirit-like entities were believed to reside in all things, including natural phenomena and objects. Such spirits possess emotions and personalities. Peaceful spirits were known as, I'm going to get this wrong, so Nagai Matama, who brought good fortune. There were violent spirits who brought ill fortune, such as illness and natural disasters. Now, with that in mind, you've got somebody like Tajiri who's in this culture of animism, shamanism, Shintoism, who is being inundated in it as just the culture was, especially back then when he was growing up, who is then looking at all these things. And the way it goes with his story was, he said when he was a kid, he would play with bugs, and he would play with these other things, and he would imagine that they had their own little lives, their own little stories, their own little names. And then he would catch a little crab in the river, and he would come up with this little story about it. And then as he got older, he was influenced by the influx of video games like Space Invaders and other things. And that's really when he started to take off and develop his own companies. He started to eventually, with another person, develop this idea of creating an entire world of Pokemon. And of course, there's some evolution for using it correctly, evolution in there. But that's essentially what he did. And you go, okay, well, you've already got basically Pokemon called yokai through his whole culture. He just basically packaged it, marketed it, and then created all these cool storylines and fun storylines for some of them. And then it turned into a giant company. Now, if it wasn't for Nintendo, I don't think it probably would have survived. So they were really at the cusp of trying to market everything back in the 90s, and then Nintendo stepped in and helped them. And almost, immediately it kicked off like gangbusters. So people obviously resonated with it. Now keep this in mind too, during that time in culture back in the mid 90s, there was a huge shift going on from Western society being, the idea of absolute truth. Things like transcendental meditation were not common. Things like yoga, they just weren't really a thing yet. They were around, but it wasn't like it is today. And so there was this shift from early 90s to mid 90s to late 90s where a lot of things like sorcery, magic, a lot of the role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons were getting more popularized. They were becoming more mainstream. There were magic card games that were being introduced, like gangbusters. A lot of kids were getting interested in those. So that really was the reshift of kid culture into much more mainstream of this idea of being enjoying things like magic, sorcery, which is interesting that the video game market really was pushing off probably around 1988 or so, and then from there just pushing forward. So they all kind of go hand in hand with role playing games, the magic, the sorcery, the mysticism, the video games. It was all influencing kids in a new way, and so it fit. It was just the timing couldn't have been better for Pokemon to be introduced to culture and society. So that's essentially the history of it. I mean, I could get into more detail, but I don't want to get into tons. But I want people to hear that the history isn't divorced from the spirituality. The philosophies and the doctrines that were connected to Japanese culture are clearly connected with what they developed. And yeah, there's a franchise to it. Yeah, there's cute, cuddly things to it. But again, we're trying to peel back those layers. So from here, I just want to touch on the basic story, Kyle, unless you have more you want to interject or any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think a good spot as we transition into this is 1 John 4:1. Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. I think God is continually reminding us that through generation to generation, though nothing's new under the sun, Satan, our adversary, the one that is the author and father of lies, wants to continually conjure up a new way to captivate our hearts. And although, 2,000 years ago, people were still thinking about evolution, about evolving into some sort of spirit being, and you think 2,000 years ago we have become thinkers and we're living in a time where we're all about science and mechanics. Ultimately, we need to try even in this day and age, because Satan has found a way to even collaborate those ideas and put them together. No pun intended, but evolved these lies into a literal buffet of lots of religions together. And when I hear the things you're saying right now, whether people are trying to find amusement or what, this is a spiritual matter, and I think we need to handle it with such care. So no, thank you for bringing that up, and let's jump right into it. Yeah, what is the purpose and story of Pokemon?
Right. Yeah. Let me just read this really quick, and then I will get into that. So I want to remind viewers, especially those believers that are out there. I'm going to read 2 Corinthians chapter 10 as well. Verse 3, it says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds." Verse 5 says, "Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." So when we're talking about these things, now that we're getting into the discussion of more the spiritual end of things, I really want people to hear our hearts that these things affect and infect the way that we not only use our time, but our hearts themselves. If you're a Christian, you want your heart to be filled with Christ. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the first command, Jesus said. So we want to love the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean you can't go out and do some fun things as long as they're not taking away too much time. But this isn't just a fun thing. This is dealing with some deceptive and dark doctrines that Jesus died for. He died to set us free from this kind of stuff. Satan 2,000 years ago we would have called it false religion. These days we call it entertainment. So you might think that you are not worshiping these things. Even as Christians, we have that potential. But worship comes in the amount of time and money we spend in something. So if am spending tons of money and tons of time and tons of attention on something, and let me just lovingly challenge people. If you can tell me The intricate details of every Pokemon, or at least most of the Pokemon that are out there. If you can tell me the entire world story of Pokemon, and you can't tell me the history of the history of Israel, if you can't tell me things from Deuteronomy or things from the Psalms, if you can't tell me where the Gospels are found, then our challenge is, then maybe you've spent your time in the wrong place. So we're not saying you're not a Christian. If you believe Jesus died for your sins and that there are not works involved in that other than his perfect work on the cross, if you truly believe that, then Jesus has washed your sins away. You are cleansed and a blood-bought child of God. But if we are a child of God, then we should be wanting what God wants. And God does not want us walking in darkness. He wants us walking in light. So that's why we're talking again about these things. This is darkness. And the non-believer might stumble in darkness. They don't know the ways that they walk because they're in darkness already. We read that in Proverbs 4. But we need to consider our path carefully. And the only way to do that is to let God's word light our path. That's what it says in Psalm 119. Your word is a light unto my feet and a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path, I think is Psalm 119, 105. So we want God's word to light our way. And then it also says in Psalm 119, I think around verse 11, it says, your words have I hidden in my heart, or your word have I hidden in my heart that I might not sin against you. What else do you have hidden in there? And that's our loving challenge for all of us. So again, that's why we're going at this the way we are and taking the time to do it. So hopefully you're sticking with us. Basic story. So for those of you who know Pokemon already, this part, feel free to check me out. And I'm going to keep it really basic because Pokemon goes into a ton of different directions. And so the basic premise of Pokemon is that there are magical, mystical creatures that have inhabited the universe / multiverse, because Pokemon does have multiverses and maybe infinite multiverses, depending on the view you take, since the beginning of time. And at least one Pokemon is known as the god of creation itself. So this is where we want to go ahead and play a little video to help you understand some of the background and history of Pokemon.
The beginning, there was nothing but an egg, which hatched into Arceus, also known as the Pokémon God. Arceus created Giratina, Dialga, and Palkia to administer the powers of antimatter, time, and space. Where Dialga and Palkia created the basis for the world, Giratina was eventually banished by Arceus to the Distortion World for its violence. With their labors complete, Dialga and Palkia retreated to their dimensions, while Arceus continued its mission, creating 3 Lake Guardians. More legendary Pokémon like Kyogre, Groudon were formed from the depths of the world, filling the seas with water and creating land. Rayquaza, the third of these, floated high in the ozone layer and intervened whenever the 2 arch-enemies clashed. The only other Pokémon known from these times were the Mews found around the world, and Regigigas, who with his strength shaped the many regions and created 3 Titan Pokémon, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel, of clay, ice, and magma. The era of creation drew to a close as Arceus went into slumber upon creating 3 time-space orbs. Hundreds of millions of years passed, and the once great Mew population slowly declined. The first humans appeared, and the few Pokémon in the era of creation became many as prehistoric types such as Kabuto, Kabutops, and Aerodactyl appeared, ruled for 200 million years, and went extinct following a meteorite impact. Only the first Pokémon bird, Archon, and the turtle Pokémon, Tirtuga, were left to thrive and mark the beginning for a new line of Pokémon. Hundreds of millions of additional years and countless evolutions passed until the end of the last Ice Age, which led to another reduction of the number of existing Pokémon. The humans, who by now had settled most of the world, worshipped several of the legendary Pokémon or magical creatures. One of these was Regigigas until they realized the threat that his powers posed to the Pokémon world. Fearing the unknown, they sealed him and the Rock Titans away. but darker times were looming.
So we're not playing that to bore you or just drown you in details. The goal of that is so that you can see and hear. The storyline sounds like a creation story. You're talking about, and you might want to say, okay, well, this is just fantasy. It's just fictional. Okay, fine. But do I really want to be involved with something fictional that's giving a whole different story about a false God? I mean, if you listen to Mormonism, it sounds like, almost sounds like a Mormon tale. There was this, Elohim who created, that was the God of his own planet. And then he had these kids, and eventually we have Jesus and all these weird things. Satan's the half brother of Jesus. And you listen to those kind of stories and you go, wow, there's actually millions of people who follow that as a religion and spend lots of money sending it to their churches and teaching their kids as if it's true. Well, it's no different with this kind of stuff. There are people that actually hold to these ideas. Now, if they don't believe literally that that's how the world was formed, that's fine. But guess what's missing in all of that? There's no talk about God who created the universe. There is some magical creature, mystical creature that created the universe, and then he utilizes other mystical creatures to form things. And we purposely played the first 2 minutes because it also talks about rocks and other things that are magical and mystical, which is we're going to get into in discussing the witchcraft issue of Pokemon. So you can see, at least from just that 2 minutes, the backstory. And the backstory is really important when you want to examine anything. When kids are interested in Pokemon, there are very few kids that I have ever met that only stick with the trading card avenue of Pokemon. I've had plenty of parents tell me, well, my kids just like the cards and they trade them and have fun with it. Yeah, but you know what they're also doing? They're buying the books that talk about the Pokédex books that talks about the backstories of these Pokemon. And there's a lot of mysticism and sorcery and dark, dark arts that are involved in their backstories and the power they have. And so you might be fooled into thinking, or might make you feel better to think that my kids just like the cards. In fact, I've had plenty of kids tell me that. Well, I just like the cards. But then after I explain to them what it really is, if they are still unwilling to let them go, then there's something else. There's another component to that. And they may not even realize what it is. They're kids. They may not realize what's really going on. But we as grown-ups, we as Christians should. So that's, the basic story. You notice evolution is a huge part of it. And in our talking points, I didn't write that down as a specific talking point, but you're going to hear us talking about that element of Pokemon often. And pun intended on the word element, because the elements of Pokemon are, the creation. So you're going to hear like things about rocks and things about water Pokemon and different kinds of Pokemon that basically are the elements. And in witchcraft, that's exactly what they use. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But you'll also hear you caught it, I hope, if you were paying attention. Millions of years go by, millions of years go by, millions of years go by. So if your kid is following any of the backstories, if they're following any of the messages, they're hearing millions and millions of years over and over and over. The evolution concept of Pokemon is interwoven, and there's a reason for that, because, and we talked about this in our original discussion back 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, was in witchcraft or in any kind of occultism, you need evolution, because how does man become a god without evolution? You need evolution. And evolution, way before it was popularized by Charles Darwin or Charles Lyell, way before then, the occultists and the people practicing Wicca and all of those kind of groups, they were believing in evolution for many, many years spiritually. So it just got repackaged and sanitized by people like Charles Darwin, calling it science. But it is science falsely so-called, and the Bible addresses that.
Right. And interesting, like when you pointed out Mormonism, it's as, as they teach, as God once was, man will be. And I think all religions, except for Christianity, can really associate with this whole theological conclusion. They all believe that at some point they do get to esteem themselves to be like gods. And that really does tie everything together, whether it's shamanism, whether it's Buddhism or Mormonism. Like, it really does tie together. So thank you for pointing that out, Flynn.
So regarding the evolution, Kyle, some people that are listening or watching might say, well, yeah, but in Pokemon, the people are not necessarily evolving. So you could say, yeah, that's true. However, the idea of the pocket monsters, these mystical, magical creatures, these yokai that people are engaging with, are certainly evolving, but also allowing the Pokemon trainers to become masters. So without the Pokemon, without the magical, mystical creatures, the trainers cannot become masters. And that's a good segue here. I'm going to read to you the original theme song of Pokemon. So back when the original cartoon came out with Ash, and he's that cartoon's been around forever now. But here's what the original theme song was, and so many people know it already, but they could probably sing it in their sleep. But it says, "I want to be the very best, like no one ever was. To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause. I will travel across the land, searching far and wide. Teach Pokemon to understand the power that's inside." Then the chorus goes, "Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all. It's you and me. I know it's my destiny. Pokemon, oh, you're my best friend. In a world we must defend. Pokemon, gotta catch 'em all. A heart so true. Our courage will pull us through. You teach me, and I'll teach you. Oh, Pokemon, gotta catch them all, gotta catch them all." I'm going to read verse 2 as well. It says, "Every challenge along the way with courage I will face. I will battle every day to claim my rightful place. Come with me, the time is right. There's no better team. Arm in arm we'll win the fight. It's always been our dream." Now, if you take away the whole Pokemon and nostalgia and excitement and entertainment value, if you just read that as a poem, I don't know about you, but I feel like Satan's just talking right there. And I'm not going to say Satan wrote this thing, but I can't not say that it's certainly inspired by darkness. Like this is to listen to this, even me reading it, I go, ugh. You look at this and you think kids hear this over and over. And when I was reading comments on this, because there's actually a discrepancy, a lot of people thought that the first verse, it actually said each Pokemon to understand the power that's inside. But it's actually, when I listen to the song, it does sound like each Pokemon to understand. But apparently the official lyrics say teach Pokemon to understand. Now there's different views on why that changed or why that was not in the original lyrics, or at least doesn't sound like it is. But either way, it's relevant to us. Either way, it sounds terrible. So just for those that are listening that are Pokemon fanatics, they might say, no, it's each Pokemon. It's actually teach Pokemon. But the song itself sounds like each Pokemon. I listened to it like 10 times last night trying to see if I could hear it. But I want to be the very best, like no one ever was. To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause. And this is the franchising market, but also Satan's smart. You get kids to understand that the motivation of being a Pokemon trainer is to continue to train these Pokemon so they can become stronger and stronger. And so the goal is that once they become strong enough, then what happens is they evolve. The pocket monsters, these magical creatures that look very harmless at first, and then they will evolve. And they usually have 3 stages that they evolve. Most of them have an evolutionary process, not all of them. But they will evolve and become stronger and stronger. So you have these Pokeballs that you use to catch the you get an original Pokemon when you are 10. So that's what happens with Ash. He gets this Pikachu, and Pikachu is kind of this rebellious. I don't want to listen. I'm different than every other Pokemon. I don't want to go inside my Pokeball. I'm not going to listen to you. So he has to really learn how to train this thing. And they go through all these things to learn how to work together. And then when Pikachu is strong enough, then you use Pikachu to attack the other Pokemon. And then if the Pokemon's weaker, then you catch that Pokemon and you continue to collect these Pokemon. There is this weird connection as I was reading more about this again, thinking about, Ghostbusters when they were catching the ghosts and they had those, I forget what they were called, but those little buckets that they would slide under the ghost and then they would
capture them.
Yeah, capture them. And I think, isn't it funny? It is kind of the same thing, except we're not talking about ghosts. We're talking about yokai or magical, mystical creatures. And they do look very cute and harmless. I was watching the episode 1 last night, and I thought, if I'm just a kid, I would have been so in love with Pokemon as a kid because that was just my wheelhouse. That just wasn't out yet. And it does. It looks fun. It looks harmless. All the creatures look kind of fun. The songs are fun and exciting, and it draws you in. But as time goes on, they evolve into these more powerful, more sinister creatures, and then they become darker even than that. Some of them, and so that's where we really have to, be careful and be wise as to the kind of the storyline, the plot line. But this one part here, and I'm going to go back to this several times, but to train them is my cause. I will travel across the land, searching far and wide, teach Pokemon to understand the power that's inside. And that's really the premise. The entire premise of Pokemon is to gather all these pocket monsters, these yokai, these mystical creatures, so that they'll do your bidding. And we'll talk about the idea of occultism and New Age, because that's all tied in, and shamanism, so that they'll do your bidding. Now, if you're not experienced enough, or your pocket monster is not experienced enough, it can lose a battle. And that's another issue that you have. So the goal is just, you've got to keep building it up. You've got to keep going, because the way you grow them and evolve them is gather experience points and keep training them. When you play the video games, in order to grow them, you have to keep playing the game, which again is a great marketing tactic. So reading this again is just out loud, just kind of makes my skin crawl a little bit. But eventually, you catch the pocket monsters with the Pokeball, and once they're caught, you become their master if you have enough expertise. But the goal is then that do you hear what it said in the song? You teach them and they teach you. So there's this weird relationship between the pocket monsters and the child. And it's just so interesting. It's always a child, right? But the pocket monster teaches you, and you teach the pocket monster. Now, what a deceptive tactic that is. And a lot of times when kids are being taught in public schools, things like transcendental meditation, guided imagery, and spirit guides, they're taught to have a spirit animal. And this was all happening around the same time, right before Pokemon came out, like in the early 1990s. And Barrett Chose's book, Brave New Schools, deals with this extensively, about the things that were going on, starting to change in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. Kids were starting to learn how to have spirit guides in school. And they were calling it, health reasons, mental health, creating, peace and calmness in the classroom, helping kids deal with their anxieties, or whatever you want to say. But they were using all of those kind of tactics to introduce these things. And they would just tell the kids, picture an animal, a favorite animal. And then I'm going to walk you through this guided imagery, and I'm going to walk you through this hypnotic kind of storyline. And you're going to have a guide that'll show up. And there are kids that were trained basically how to tap into the spirit world unknowingly to them, based on these, cute, cuddly creatures that weren't Pokemon at that point, but they were spirit guides. And the thing about spirit guides, that anybody that's in the New Age knows, they might come across helpful and benevolent at first, but not always. Over time, they get worse and worse, more powerful. So this tactic, and we're going to talk more about that, is exactly what's being introduced to kids, and by the millions.
Yeah. And I think before we get into the 5 key breakdowns that we're really going to discuss here, Flynn, I really want to point out Deuteronomy 18. Starting in verse 10, it says, "There shall not be found among you any that makes his son or his daughter." So some people say, well, they're kids. Allow them to be kids and use their imagination and their fantastical ideas and let them develop and grow. No, the Lord actually has a way to tells us how to teach our kids. And it says, not let anyone make his son or his daughter to pass through the fire, or cause and use divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. Why? Why does the Lord care about these things? Because it's an abomination unto the Lord. Because God is spirit, and he actually created us to be in communion with him, not with the lies and distortions of Satan. And his little minions, the fallen angels, are happy to transform, like you said earlier, into an angel of light, or into an interdimensional being that looks like an alien, that you are now captivated and no longer thinking about the Lord. His issue is he sees us not having our attention to him who is the best, the perfect, the almighty, the creator and sustainer of all things. Why wouldn't he want us to have our eyes on him? It's not because he's proud or boastful in a needing to have our attention. It's that it's the best thing for us. Right. So we need to teach our children the same way, and not to take fantastical ideas in a way of just creativity. But God is creative. We can get their attention enough with just how powerful and mighty he is, and we should use that as such to teach them.
Absolutely. And when I'm going to go back to the song again, because one of the things that came to mind as I was reading, especially verse 2, excuse me, it says, "Every challenge along the way with courage I will face." Now, as a Christian, even as a Christian child, who am I supposed to say that to? I'm not supposed to look to a pocket monster, magical, mystical, creature to do that. Every challenge along the way with courage I will face. I will battle every day to claim my rightful place. Now, we don't have a rightful place, so that's foolishness and pride. Come with me. The time is right. Who's talking here? Is this the Pokemon trainer talking to the Pokemon? Come with me. The time is right. There's no better team. Arm in arm. Now, I don't know about you, but I really want to, at some level, say I want to walk arm in arm with the Lord, not arm in arm with some mystical, magical yokai that comes from, really dark folklore or dark mystical arts. Arm in arm will win the fight. What fight? Well, because the fight is we have to protect the earth, and that's very New Agey. So our job is to protect all of the living animated creatures, the animism. We have to protect it all. So we're the good, and then there's the bad. That's the idea of balance, or yin and yang. It's always been our dream. Now, who's the our there? You've got a plural possessive pronoun there. Whose dream is that? Is that the Pokemon trainer talking to the Pokemon, saying that the Pokemon and the Pokemon trainer have the same dream? I mean, this gets into some really weird, thoughts in my mind anyway. And a lot of that, you talk about God doesn't want us to engage anything to find our courage other than him. Why? Because he knows that there's an enemy that wants to destroy our souls. He knows that he has the best for us. Jesus said, if you stay in my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus said, I came to, if the Son makes you free, you're free indeed. And Jesus said, I come to give you life and life abundantly. So Jesus came to give us life. Satan does not come to bring us life. And we're training kids, or the enemy's training kids. We're giving them permission to be trained to become trainers and masters of their own destiny, masters of their own universe, through collecting these pocket monsters that are going to give them power and knowledge. It said, I'll teach you and you'll teach me. So they're looking for knowledge. That's really the Gnosticism part of this. And then, there's been plenty of reports where kids will wear the Pokemon creatures around their neck, almost like talisman or like little trinkets. But, in a lot of cultures, you wear those for power. You wear those for protection. And there are kids that are now connecting because they've been introduced to so much magic and mysticism through public school and through these movies and shows and books over the years. They recognize the connection probably much better than parents do, because that's their world. They're inundated with this stuff. They're just buried with it, just literally brainwashed with this kind of stuff. So we as parents can't just dismiss it as another cartoon or another obsession or the next in the latest of popular franchises. We need to understand, every franchise has a message, whether it's Star Wars or Marvel, and Pokemon is no different. And it's all the same message. It's just repackaged differently for different people. But, the goal is to get have your Pokeball. You catch as many of these things as you can, and your goal is to gain power and to gain knowledge. And when I talk to my kids, those students in my class who absolutely were inundated with it, and I asked them, is that what the goal of this is? And they all agreed, yes, it is. The goal is that I can become the master, the ruler, the one who has all the knowledge and all the power. That's for the first episode, when Ash wants his Pokemon, the reason he wants to become a Pokemon trainer is so that he can catch them all and become the best. Now, that alone is antithetical to Scripture. Jesus said, Paul said that John said, that I must decrease, John the Baptist, and Christ may increase. Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. Paul said, I die daily. There's nothing good in my flesh, nothing good in me, my flesh. The only thing good is Christ in me. So we as Christians should, even at that level, be reminding kids, look, we're not about being the best, and we don't have a right to these things. But yeah, I just put together 5 careful things to consider. And again, I'm not going to, I didn't add evolution as a specific part to this, but keep in mind, evolution is huge in Pokemon. It is all over the place. So we have plenty of videos and articles on the dangers of evolution, spiritually, scientifically, why you could trust the Bible. But kids that are hearing evolution over and over and over in shows, eventually it becomes part of their thinking. And when you go to the Bible and the Bible says God created in 6 literal days and rested for 1, you want kids to understand that that's the truth of history. That's the truth. And when you have shows like Pokemon and other shows that are teaching a completely different message over and over and over, and I'll guarantee kids are spending 100 times more time, amount of time on Pokemon than in their Bibles if they are into this kind of thing. So, we want to make sure that we're not allowing them to have a different idea about where we came from, evolution is just completely in the face of God in the Bible. So we want to just be wise on those things. But it is, if you ask any kid, the Time magazine, and I'm just going to hold it up. We'll probably put a picture up of it anyway. But the Time magazine thing that came out, the Time magazine that just came out, I can't speak. It says Pokemon, the games, the shows, the evolution. Because we know, they know, that evolution is a huge deal with it. And the new box set that's coming out, Prismatic Evolution, they understand there's a creature that was introduced. It wasn't introduced new in this new box set, but it was introduced new in, I think, 2016 or so. And there's a Pokemon called Eevee, which is based off of the idea of evolution. So you've got plenty of evolution being filtered all throughout this. So as we're talking about this, please understand that is a huge component to the entire game. But the first thing I wrote is it just a game? Or the first question I'm going to ask is it just a game? Is it just a conviction thing? And this is where I think Christians will probably throw up their biggest argument is, look, it's just a conviction. If you're convicted against Pokemon, when I talked to my former administrator down in Tucson about several things, including Star Wars, I gave her my backstory about how some of these things really influenced the way that I saw the world and led me far down a dark hole of occultism and drugs. She said, oh, well, that's why you're so sensitive toward these things, is because of that. So now I understand. I'm like, wait, no, that's not it. I don't have a sensitivity toward it just because it's my conviction. Yeah, I have a clear conviction. I hope you guys can tell that Kyle and I both have a conviction about these things. But it's biblically based, not emotionally based. And so I think that's really, and Kyle, you just got into an interesting conversation with somebody recently on this very issue.
Yeah, and I think when we're discussing these things, I think Romans 14 really does break it down. Unfortunately, a lot of people read Romans 14 as a permission to build a gray area in their life, and actually read Romans 14 the total opposite. So I think for everyone, the encouragement is to go and read the scriptures. And if you want to hyper focus on Romans 14, make sure and evaluate the context that it's actually an encouraging a separation from idolatry. It's encouraging sanctification. It's drawing you closer to God. And when it's talking about permitting things and eating food and things like that, it's still in the context of growing and knowing Christ. And interesting enough, at the very last verse, it says anything apart from faith is sin. And so then you go, wow, that's a really broad brush to paint. Anything apart from faith is sin. Well, yeah, because God calls us to be sanctified by what? By the truth. And that word, anything apart from faith, that word faith in the Greek is actually pistis, which actually means conviction. So anything apart from conviction of the truth, actually, I want to make sure and define that word properly. Pistis actually means conviction of the truth. So anyone that is doing things in their life that is absent of conviction in the truth is in sin. And so now the question really becomes very personal. Can you operate and participate in Pokemon with an absence, with a direct conviction of the truth, knowing and being sanctified by godliness, by trusting and loving God, who he is and what he's done for us, that he's indwelling inside of us because the believer is now born again and has the Holy Spirit dwelled within us. We are the temple of God. So are you saying you're now participating in these things in direct faith of serving him? And that becomes very clear. It's not gray anymore for most of us when we're letting the scripture really lead us in conviction.
Right. And that's what you just said there, letting the scripture lead us in conviction. So our job is not to be led by emotion, led by nostalgia, led by entertainment, led by the pack, the crowd. Our job is to be led by the Spirit of God. If we keep in step with the Spirit, we will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. So our job is to weigh everything, capture every thought to the obedience of Christ, but it's also to weigh out the scriptures carefully, to read them, understand them, and allow those scriptures that we've read from the Bible to then measure everything that we watch, everything that we say, everything that we think, everything we do. Wow, that is a minute by minute task that we desperately need the Holy Spirit's help on. That's why we're indwelled with the Spirit of God. And we are clearly not saying that people, that there's sinless perfection attainable on this planet. But as we said in the previous video, I rewatched our discussion from 8 years ago, and I thought, boy, there's a lot of good reminders, not because we said it, but because they were from the scriptures. We should not be convicted by emotion, and that's not what we're saying. If you say, well, I have this conviction or I have that conviction, oftentimes when people say that, they're talking about their own heart, their own feelings. And if that was true 6, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, boy, it's even more so true now. So be careful of saying, well, I just don't have a conviction in that area. I'm fine with that area. Kai, why don't you read really quickly? I'm thinking of the conscience being seared. And can you read for us? I think it's in 1 Timothy, maybe chapter 4, just a couple verses there dealing with that as we're moving forward.
Sure, yeah. 1 Timothy 4, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now the Spirit speaks expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared with a hot iron."
So as Christians, we might say, well, I don't have a conviction in this, or I don't have a conviction in that. But in reality, we have to be careful of the reality of having our conscience seared. And so there are times when if we continue in sin, even as a Christian, you may end up having an area where it's no longer about, oh, I feel bad about this. That's why it's good to have a short account with God, because, if we've sinned in an area, usually when we first start in that area, we go, oh, that's really bad. I shouldn't have done that. Your conscience kicks in. But if you continue to go in that area, your conscience can be seared like a hot iron, or with a hot iron. And eventually you just don't have the feeling anymore. But that doesn't make it right. It just means you don't feel bad about it anymore. So that's why we need to let God's word, not our feelings, motivate us and move us. And if you've been continuing in these areas for a while, you're probably already at that point of not really feeling necessarily any check of the Spirit, any conviction about it, any conviction about it. So that's where we have to be careful, and please step back if you've been involved in these things, because there is a spiritual component even as a Christian. You're not inoculated from the deceptions of the world. In fact, most of the New Testament was written to warn us as believers not to be deceived. So we don't want to be deceived ourselves. And even if you, for some reason, think, oh, this is fine for me, but there are plenty of people, maybe your children, they're looking to you as the example, and you don't want to pass these things on to them. So both are at stake here. And, Pokemon has a long-term view. They want to have hundreds of years of their message being spread. I, for one, don't want to participate in that. I don't want to allow that message to continue to spread. And sometimes that means that you have to be sort of the bad guy as the parent or as the youth pastor. But if you walk a child through these things lovingly, carefully, and biblically, oftentimes the child is going to come to the conclusion that these things are ungodly anyway. You just have to help them see past the thin veneer of entertainment and cuteness of the show and the message. So, is it just a game? No, and we've addressed that before. It is not just a game. So, I mean, we've talked about Satan has many avenues before. He masquerades as an angel of light. Oftentimes, these kind of things, they look harmless to start. And you'll notice as Ash gets deeper into the Pokemon world, there's a lot of challenges and darkness that starts coming. He starts being introduced to a lot of mystical, really deeply mystical and occultic Pokemon, which we'll get into kind of as we wrap things up. I mean, Satan's message is you shall be like gods. That's clearly the message in Pokemon. So is that something that's just a game? Was it just a game that Satan said that to Adam and Eve? I would say no. And the last thing I'm going to really say, or one of the last things in this point, is we as Christians are not pragmatists. We shouldn't just do something because it works or believe something because we like it. We need to be biblical, not pragmatic. And so the Bible is clear. Kyle read Deuteronomy 18. There are plenty of scriptures. 1 Samuel, I think maybe 15, also deals with this issue that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So we want to be very careful that we don't practice a rebellious attitude. And I will tell you, and Kyle, I'm sure you can affirm this as well, when we get involved in things that have occultic or witchcraft leanings, there is a rebellion that can stir up in our own hearts against God and the things of God. We start to lose the desire, the taste for godly things. And so be careful of that as well as we're going through and talking about these. Some of the consistent repeated themes as we're considering whether this is just a game, and anybody who's been involved with Pokemon will have to agree with these themes. Here are some of the themes. I just wrote them down. Balance, which is a mystical Eastern idea. False gods, many false gods. We watch one of the creator gods. Pocket monsters, magical creatures. That's what we've been talking about. A focus on creation instead of the creator. So it's all about creation, which is witchcraft. Evolution, hugely, both spiritual and physical. Psychic power. Animism, that there's life in everything. Life meaning not like plants are obviously alive, but not like humans. So there's differences in life, but in animism there is not. There's also a spiritual connection to that. Collecting magical creatures to do your bidding. Well, that's interesting. Alternate dimensions, wormholes, and aliens. The idea of the aura, which is very mystical. Yoga, mega evolution, and spirits. Those are just a few things that I wrote down. Telepathy is another one. Telekinesis is another one. All kinds of strange mystical things that in many religions they actually practice and believe. Many of those also are practiced and believed in Japanese culture. So the next thing in this area that I want to point out, dealing with is it just a game, is not so much the videos or the movies, not so much the collectible cards, but the role-playing games. So this area has been, I think, this is where I get into the word desensitization, because we talked about that a lot when we were interviewing people through the occult series, and even with Carl, we were talking a little bit about this. That as a Christian culture, we have become so pop Christianized and secularized and psychologized that we've really become desensitized to the dangers of occultism, the dangers of mysticism, and the delusion of it. It's easy for people these days to become a bit deluded. And one of the biggest ways to do that is in role-playing games. So as a kid, it's fun to play games and pretend you're so-and-so and you go out and have these adventures. That's not what I'm talking about. But there are role-playing games that mix fantasy and reality, but the fantasy that they're dealing with is actually mysticism. And Dungeons and Dragons was the big one. Now, Christians today would probably, a lot of them would laugh at the idea of Dungeons and Dragons being bad. There are even some Christians, unfortunately, that laugh at the idea that the Ouija board is bad. But anybody who's looked into these things knows that the messages and the ability to tap into these things, tap into the dark messages that they offer are real. It's a real thing. and people unfortunately get drawn into it. So when you have this idea of this connection between the physical and the spiritual, a word that kept coming to mind as I was doing the research is ritualism. And in all of these different, all kinds of different shamanistic religions, tribal religions that are around the world, a lot of them are in Japan, but there's also, Indian cultures, American Indian cultures. The idea of ritualism is really big. And the reason for ritualism being so big, number one, it connects the physical to the spiritual, which is witchcraft. We'll talk about that. But also it's really big because you have this idea of repetitiveness, which creates a connection with muscle memory, but it's not just muscle memory, it's heart memory. So when you have a connected ritual that is attaining something spiritual, you're not like when you're learning guitar or piano or anything that's new, there's a bit of muscle memory, dribbling a ball, whatever it is. That obviously there's muscle memory. Our bodies are designed to have that. But when you go beyond dribbling a basketball to doing something that's physical to attain something that's spiritual, that's ritualism in the religious sense. And when that ritual becomes so integrated in your life that unfortunately what will happen is it can become so integrated that it replaces the relationship you have with God. And those rituals also cause you to shut down your mind. You stop thinking because of those rituals. And you also then become very much more open and obedient to that ritual. It's very hard to undo that ritual. Anybody who has an addiction, that's what's going on at some level, whether it's pornography or smoking cigarettes, there's a lot of ritual to it that's part of the hard thing to let go of, is just the ritual of it. So I would say with role-playing games, dealing with Dungeons and Dragons, there used to be a lot of Magic games that are still out there. They're just not as popular anymore. And the Pokemon, the role-playing games of Pokemon, and where people get together in these giant conferences, bringing all their Pokemon games or cards that they play with the role-playing games, the RPGs. So you've got all of those, and you just continue to do it over and over and over and over. Even the trading cards, there's ritual to it. You're touching these cards, how they feel, how they look, and then you're engaging with other people on it. Excuse me. So, that all of that ritual is part of the game that becomes very entwined with who you are. It becomes your reality because of the ritual. And that is a big part of the dangers that is in Pokemon. And that is arguably why Pokemon will continue to be so popular, is not just because it's a popular message. There have been a lot of cartoons and other things that have these kind of messages, but it's because of that role-playing activity, which actually has the potential of causing somebody to move beyond reality into fantasy. I'm going to just read a couple quotes really quick from Barrett on one of her articles she had on Pokemon from Crossroads, her website. I'm just going to read it verbatim so I don't get anything off on it. But the first quote was, "Remember, in the realm of popular role-playing games, whether it's Pokemon, Magic the Gathering, or other selections, the children become the master. As in contemporary witchcraft, he or she wields the power." And that's what these role-playing games are. You become the one who's controlling everything. You're deciding things. You're doing things. You are the master. In other words, you're the Pokemon master. Their arm, their mind, or their power symbol, the Pokemon or other action figure becomes the channel for the spiritual forces. Children from the Christian homes have learned to say, "Thy will be done." But in the role-playing world, this prayer is twisted into "my will be done." God, parents, and pastors no longer fit into the picture fantasized by the child. I thought, wow, that's powerful. In fact, I even wore my shirt I just had made, "Not mine, but thine," from Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus said, that reminding us that it's God's will. May his will be done, not our will be done. But number two, her quote that she wrote or said was, or the quote that I pulled was, "Psychologists have warned that role-playing can cause the participant to actually experience emotionally the role being played. Again, the child becomes the master, or so it seems to the player." Now, her point was, yeah, you feel like you're the master, but you're actually being played. You're the one who's being trained by the company, by the message, by whatever, to continually obey what they're training you to do. And that's her third quote that I wanted to read. "To be a winner within this system, the committed player must know and follow the rules of the game. Obedience becomes a reflex strengthened by instant rewards or positive reinforcement. Now, if anybody's played a phone game for any length of time, that's exactly what's built around every phone game. Rules and rewards force the child to develop new habits and patterns or patterned responses to certain stimuli. Now, there is a bit of rule and reward that goes on with a Christian parent. We're called to train our kids. We're called to, give them what they need, equip them, and help them to make good, godly decisions. That's our job. That is not the job of Pokemon. That's not the job of some role-playing game. And I think of, Deuteronomy 6 comes to mind, and we may read that as we go on here. The rules and rewards force the child to develop new habits and patterned responses to certain stimuli day after day. This powerful psychological process manipulates the child's thoughts, feelings, and actions until his or her personality changes. And as many parents confirm, interest in the ordinary family life begins to wither away. And so this happens with drug use. This happens with a bunch of pornography. This happens too, where you actually lose the interest of day-to-day life because you actually are just so focused on whatever that ritual is. There's a lot of components to that, but role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons or like the Pokemon games, I would say, and even video games now, especially with VR and stuff, are factored into this. We have to be careful because the world is training the children, and that is not their job. It is not Satan's job. Jesus said, "Let the children come to me." And so our job is to point them to Christ, not to ourselves and not to this world. So is it just a game? I would say no. And I said, and I wrote this. This is something, excuse me, this is something that I have thought about often when talking to kids, is where do you draw that line between fantasy and reality, from truth and fiction? Where do you draw that line? And that's a tough question. We've asked that before on this channel and gone through that. But one thing I would say that I know for sure is a line that I draw. I have for anything that I come across, whether it's on TV or I'm reading or whatever, is if in that game or in that message, it is training children or training people on how to practice these rituals, on how to practice mysticism. The simplest example is Harry Potter. In Harry Potter, it's just not just like there's magical creatures. It's that he's learning how to tap into that magic and how to utilize it. Same with Star Wars. Anytime you have somebody learning how to do these things, being trained themselves, I would say that's a hard line that, and I guess anybody's welcome to show me biblically why that's not true, but I can't think of any reason. That is the hard line for me. And from there, you have to decide where to go with that. But I would say any show, anything that deals with those kind of issues, I would say arguably it should be turned off, because not only are you watching the main character be trained, you are becoming trained, whether you want it or not. That's what's happening. So is it just a game? I think our answer here at Once Lost is unequivocally no. It's not just a game, and I think we've shown why. So after looking a little bit at the dangers of is it just a game, or the challenge of is it just a game, and our answer is no, it's dangerous. That's clear. I mean, I think we've built at least a good basic case for that. The second thing that we decided we wanted to cover here is consider its origins. So as we're considering things, consider, is it just a game? Is it just a conviction? I think we've shown biblically that it's not. But and just through the facts, consider its origins. So this is something we already talked about, but I did want to point this out. Anytime you are looking at anything, especially entertainment-wise, look at its backstory, look at its message, look at its origins. And Satoshi Tajiri, Pokemon's originator, was from Japan. This is obviously essential. So I want to point out a couple things about Japanese culture that people might not be aware of, depending, and this is the apologetics section for us. This is part of our heart, is so people can understand whether it's Catholicism or evolution. In Japan, Shintoism is really big, and you might go, Shinto, what? I don't know what that means. But believe it or not, a lot of the culture we have today in America is influenced by the East more than it is the West. So a lot of these things, whether you know the names or not, you are familiar with a lot of this. If you've watched any shows for any length of time, you're going to catch some of this. But I pointed this out earlier in 2015. About 70% of there were about 70% of Japan was Shinto. The main belief in Shintoism, again, I'm going to read this, is the reverence of kami, which are spirits or deities that inhabit nature and ancestors. Now, if you connect with Pokemon, you start to see this connection here. So you've got somebody who's heavily influenced in Shintoism. He's got this idea of these yokai, but also the Shinto-specific beliefs, because the yokai were more like a traditional folklore that's just pervasive. But then you have the Shinto idea of the kami, which are spirits, deities that inhabit nature and ancestors, emphasizing living in harmony with the natural world and maintaining purity through ritual practices like purification rites, essentially respecting nature and ancestral spirits as divine beings called kami is central to Shinto beliefs. Key points really quickly. Number one, kami. These spirits can reside in natural elements, which sounds a lot like Pokemon, like mountains, trees, rivers, and even in people and objects. Number two, purity. Maintaining purity through ritual washing. Rituals, again, washing and cleansing is key to connect with the kami. Number three, harmony with nature. Shinto emphasizes living in harmony with the natural world and respecting all living things. Number four, ancestral worship. Venerating ancestors as kami is also a significant part of Shinto practices. Now, this isn't exclusive to Japanese culture, but you will see this all throughout Pokemon ideas, that there are these creatures, but also there is a direct tie-in with the creatures and spirits, things that have died and become a Pokemon. So that is something to keep in mind. Festivals and shrines. Shinto rituals and celebrations often take place at shrines dedicated to specific kami. You'll notice a lot of shrines and a lot of things like that in Pokemon. Another piece to the puzzle. So Shintoism is specific, but within Shintoism and a lot of culture or a lot of religions is animism. So I'm going to just quickly define that. Animism is a large component within Shintoism. Animism is the belief that all things in the world have a spirit, which we also call panentheism or pantheism. But animism believes all things have a spirit or a soul and are animated with an agency and free will. The term comes from the Latin word anima, which means breath, spirit, or life. Isn't that interesting? It sounds like a replacement for the breath of life that God gave Adam, which he did not breathe into creation other than Adam and Eve. Animism is commonly a common belief system among indigenous cultures around the world. It's often so fundamental in their worldview that they may not have a word for animism or religion in their language. And this is something we've talked about on this channel before. Often is that most culture around the world, their system of religion is integrated with their day-to-day life. It is not separate, and you have to understand that when you look at someone like someone who developed something like Pokemon. Some basic characteristics of animism. Number one is the belief in spirits. Animists believe that all things have a spirit, including animals, plants, rocks, rivers. Again, this is something you're going to see throughout Pokemon. Shamanism is connected with animism. Shamanism is often a significant part of animistic communities. Shamans are the trained professionals who contact the spirit world. Now, this is the part that to me connects with everything. And I'm going to probably bring this up again later. Well, I will bring it up later, so I'm going to pause. That's number three. So belief in shamanism, the shamans are trained professionals who contact the spirit world to heal and promote the well-being of the community. Not only heal and promote, they actually contact the spirits to attain knowledge and power. Shamans also understand that there are dangerous spirits, so they have to be careful because they can open doors that they can't close. So that's also in the New Age, which is also in Pokemon. Number three, beliefs about the afterlife. There are no universal doctrines about what happens to a person after death. This is something you'll see throughout Pokemon, that there's just this weird mystical idea about things that die and ghosts, and there's no hell, there's no judgment, there's no biblical idea of the afterlife. Some believe that person's spirit continues to exist after death, either by being reincarnated or moving to a higher spiritual level. Number four, beliefs about the high God, little g. Many animists believe that there is a high God that created the world. We just watched that a little bit ago. And then move on to other interests. And that's something you'll notice. Like for us as believers, knowing that Jesus is the creator is not a point I move on from. That is something that is central to my belief, not for necessarily salvation, although it's sure helpful, but it is a central belief as for me as a Christian to know that Jesus, my God who saved me, is the same God who created this universe and holds it together by his word. That is central. So if you have kids watching a show day after day, hour after hour, playing card games over and over, every time they go to Target or every time they go to Walmart, they're begging you to buy more cards for Pokemon because they just got to have them all, right? Which is a great marketing tactic. But also that means that they're hungering for something other than the Bible. They're hungering for something other than the creator of the universe. And I would say as parents and, youth group leaders and pastors, and we need to be careful of that. Teachers, belief about a high God, I'll read it again. Many animists believe that the high God created the world and then move on to other interests. Animism can also be found in some modern religions such as Japanese Shintoism, Buddhism, and neo-paganism. And we also have talked about panentheism. And panentheism is the idea that God is in, not himself, but God itself, the power of God, is in all of creation. And that God is utilizing and needing people to help God continue to attain God, to grow, and that we can grow with God arm in arm. And also that evolution is a huge piece of that puzzle in panentheism because things are evolving and growing and we're evolving and growing. And so that message, and we're not saying that someone, from Japan who believes these things, like Tajiri, we're not saying that they necessarily are trying to deceive the world. I don't know his heart. What we are saying is he's deceived. Like he's walking in darkness. So the message he's purporting, the ideas that he's passing along, Satan's happy to use any vehicle he wants. They don't have to necessarily know that they're being used, right? So when weeds are being transported, the person that has the seeds on them or whatever, a dog runs into the woods, they come back out full of weeds and full of like little seed pods. They don't know that they're being used to transport those seeds. They're just doing it. And I think a lot of times that happens. And so we're not trying to necessarily say that Tajiri, that there's some big conspiracy, but what we are saying is Satan certainly knows what he's doing, and he does have a message, and he's utilizing people who walk in the darkness who are already deceived to pass that message along. And we should know better. We're children of the light. We should walk as children of the light. So that's all of what I had for the second point. And I know I hit it quick. I hit it hard, but you have to understand the connection of the origin story of somebody like Satoshi Tajiri, because that's the culture he lived in: animistic, shamanistic, and I'll get into that in a little bit, but and also Shintoistic. So if you know anything about Pokemon at all, or if you watch or read anything on it, my goodness, it sounds just like what I just read. All of that is in there. They just don't call it religion, right? That's their way of life.
Before you get into the third point, Flynn, I as you're saying all these things, I'm really thinking about a specific verse. I hope you don't mind me reading. I wanted to read a few verses because I think that as the Christian and the non-believer watching this video can really start to see the collective presentation we're trying to put together here. And I think the Lord did a fantastic job of just explaining the folly of idolatry. When you're explaining the background and the origins of this story, God has compelled Israel tons of times dealing with this very specific situation. And I think the church today needs to hear that same message the same way that God was compelling and calling Israel to stand out from the pagan world. And so I just thought it would be really necessary to read that. It's in Isaiah 44, starting in verse 9. This is God now giving the message to Israel. He says, "They that make a graven image are all of them vanity, and their delectable things shall not profit, and they are their own witnesses. They see not, nor know that they may be ashamed. Who has formed a god, or molten a graven image that is profitable for nothing? Behold, all his fellows shall be ashamed, and the worksmen, they are men. Let them all be gathered together, let them stand up, yet they shall fear, and they shall be ashamed together. The smith with the tongs both works in the coals and fashions it with hammers, and they work it with the strength of their own arms. Yea, he is hungry, and his strengths fail. He drinks no water, and he is faint. It's talking about the labor that we put into these idols. The carpenter stretches out his rule and he marks it out with a line. He fits it with a plane and he marks it out with a compass, and he makes it after the figure of a man, according to the beauty of a man, that it may remain in the house. This is mean that the very details, the very minor details, and as Flynn's talking about Pokemon and the very story, I mean, they're crafty. This is not something that's just like this big ugly picture and you're like, oh, who would ever believe this? No, this is a very crafted teaching. In verse 14, it continues. It says, he hews down the cedars, he takes the cypress with an oak, and the oak which he strengthens for himself among the trees of the forest. He plants an ash, and he rains down and the rains nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he will take thereof and warm himself. Yea, he kindles it, and he bakes bread. He makes a god, and he worships it. He makes it, and he marks it a graven image, and falls down unto it. He burns part of it in the fire, which part he does also eat the flesh. He roasteth the roast, and is satisfied. Yea, he warms himself by it, and says, Aha, I am warm, I have seen the fire. And the residue thereof he makes a god, even his graven image. He falls down unto it, and worships it, and he prays to it, and he says, Deliver me, for you are my God. They have not known nor understood, for he has shut their eyes. They cannot see, in their hearts they cannot understand. And none considers in his heart, neither is there knowledge nor understanding to say, I have burned part of it in the fire. Yea, also I have baked bread upon the coals thereof. I have roasted flesh and eaten it. And shall I make the residue thereof an abomination? Shall I fall down to the stalk of a tree? He feeds on the ashes. A deceived heart has turned him aside, that he cannot deliver his soul, nor say, Is there not a lie in my right hand? And this is the folly of what we do as creatures. As Flynn is explaining the shamanism, we're not trying to put down the people as in like how foolish are you to believe these things. No, it's the craftiness of Satan. And this stuff is woven throughout tons of cultures. And if you look at the basis of all religions, it's ultimately folly, because you are naturally trying to create your own image, worship it, and not even find full satisfaction from it. And God is saying, I'm the creator and maker of all things. Look to me. And we're like, oh no, I'm going to find power and creativity in the things that I lift up out of the tree or out of the things that I carve. And God says, leave that alone. Pay attention. You're not understanding that you cannot find power in created things. Come to me, the creator of all things.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you read those verses, the thing that kept sticking out as well to me was they didn't know these things. They didn't realize, like, oh, well, this thing that I'm burning in the fire to warm me is the same thing I'm worshiping. There is a delusion that happens because we naturally want to worship the works of our hands. So when you're dealing with a culture like a Japanese Shintoistic culture, that's exactly how they're approaching from cradle to grave if they don't know the gospel. And I will tell you, I mean, anybody who's a missionary would know that Christianity is really minute in Japan. It is very hard to get Christianity into Japanese culture for a variety of reasons. But they have this integrated system of seeing the world as animistic, seeing the world as what we just described, with all of this kind of this life in everything and their ancestral worship. So when you're a Japanese person looking at something like Pokemon, you're not looking at just an entertainment. You're looking at, this is how I see the world. And these creatures that are running around, these mystical, magical creatures, they're seeing those in their belief system as actual spirits. So we have to understand that that's how this was all developed. It wasn't just developed as entertainment. And it may be entertaining to them because that's their life. Just like I can write a story about something biblical and that's entertaining to me because that's my life. Jesus is our life. But in the same regard, it is still a message that is completely against Scripture. And yet, we'll go back and say this over and over. We're happy to hand our kids over to it over and over. We're happy to pay money to have our children be indoctrinated and just deceived and desensitized to everything biblical. And then we wonder why, when they go to church on Sunday or Sunday night or Wednesdays, why they're so disinterested in Scripture. Well, because they've been filled up with the world. They have no interest in the Bible when they've been filled up and diluted and desensitized by worldly things. It's hard. It's hard to get their attention. But I will guarantee, if you bring up these kind of things to children in a youth group, if you're prepared to talk about some of the stuff that we've talked about and help move them from a place of just actual ritualistic devotion to Pokemon to understanding the spiritual dangers and the disconnect that they've already created in themselves. If you explain some of that biblically, I will guarantee that you're going to have people probably for the first time going, I didn't realize this is going on. So that's our challenge. And from there, Kyle, I think that's a great section of Scripture, and I think it's probably worth then moving on to the next part. I put down for number 3, which ties in kind of with the backstory, the origins, is consider the pattern of occultism and shamanism, and we've talked about this. So again, this ties in with the evolution, or the spiritual evolution of things. But I wrote down here, in Pokemon, each trainer's goal is to become a powerful ascended master by capturing as many mystical creatures as possible. These mystical creatures will help you attain knowledge and power. This is the pattern for shamanism. Now, in animistic cultures around the world, a shaman is the person who is the witch doctor. They are the one, and there are plenty of shows that make fun of that, but that is the person who goes and into the spirit world, whether through drugs or meditation or just a variety of other means. They end up into the spirit world, and then where they can talk to the ascended masters, and they gather information. Sometimes they'll end up opening doors to devilish creatures that create problems within their community, so they have to be careful of that. And their job is to go into the spirit world, collect as much information and as many spirits as possible, gather that information, and then bring it back to the community. And that's the shaman's goal. And in all of these these storylines, whether it's Luke Skywalker, whether it's Neo from The Matrix, whether it's Ash from Pokemon, or whatever trainer, there's a lot of different trainers now, but all these different trainers and masters, they are the shamans of the message. And what they're trying to teach through the message is that you can also become a master, an ascended master, a guide to everybody else. That is straight up occultism. And that you have to look at it as a pattern, not so much as the specifics. Oh, well, I know that Ash looks like this. He's 10 years old. He's funny and quirky and too excited and energetic, just like every other ADH kid in the planet. You watch the show and you go, well, how in the world are you going to say that this kid is going to be, is a shaman? What we're saying is the pattern is the same. And what we're teaching kids is that they can actually tap into something through particular rituals and other things. And here's what the thing is: even if they don't gather all of that from Pokemon, they're being primed for it, prepared for it. And then there's so many other messages as they get older that are going to be so similar but deeper, that they'll just be ready for the next level because Pokemon's already primed them for this idea that they can tap into the spiritual, mystical world through collecting knowledge and power. And so once they have that drilled into them, even as a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old, then when they move on, when they're in their teens, maybe they give up Pokemon, but there's plenty of other stuff that is then pushed onto them that is just the next level, the 201 or the 301 or whatever you want to call it. So I would say, again, consider the song, the original song. I want to be the very best like no one ever was. To catch them is my real test. To train them is my cause. I will travel across the land, searching far and wide. Teach Pokemon to understand the power that's inside. And that is truly what's going on here, is that we're trying to use knowledge to attain power. And if anybody is familiar with the biblical history, what did Satan, the temptation was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And Satan did two things there. He put doubt in, well, he did more than two things, but two things he did. He put doubt in Eve's mind. Did God really say? So he put doubt in Eve's mind toward God's reliable word. But the other thing he did, has not God said? Didn't God say? He did that just a little bit later. Didn't he say that your eyes would be, that you'd be open? God said that your eyes would be open. So Satan did two things there. He manipulated God's word, and he also put doubt in from God's word. And he loves to do both. And when you have these kind of shows that make it very fun to be able to tap into spiritual mystical power and see animism as a real thing, especially to Western culture that doesn't really understand it, our guard is just down to these kind of things. And the world right now is being flooded, literally flooded with anime and Eastern idea. I mean, there are so many very popular, manga is a huge thing. All the anime shows, One Punch and other things that are going on, that there's just a whole, not even subculture, there's a whole culture that just absolutely loves these things. And all it does is focus on the flesh and focus on all these kind of things that we're talking about. So I would say be careful of anything that opens that door to shamanism. And that's something that we're definitely worth considering, is the pattern of shamanism. So that's really what I have. And then also just the last thing on that one, the role of the spirits to reveal hidden knowledge. You'll notice often the message is, I don't know it yet, but I'm going to learn it. And then also the Pokemon don't know it, and I need to teach it to them, which is such an interesting relationship between the two. But the idea of this knowledge is going to be revealed. Occultism means hidden knowledge, dark secrets. So the idea that I can tap into certain things to gain knowledge through ritual is certainly occultic. So that is something definitely worth considering. The goal of this was to make it 1 hour. I don't think that's going to, we'll be lucky to get 2 hours in here. Thank you for you guys sticking with us on this. And you may have to break this up into pieces, but we wanted to get this all done in one take so that we could really just lay out a strong case, both biblically and historically and logically through this. So thank you guys for sticking with this. All right. So from there, it definitely just transitions right to number 4, was the practice of witchcraft. So we talked about this in our original discussion back 8 years ago, but it's worth the viewers to remember. There is a really simple definition for witchcraft. There's all kinds of pieces to the puzzle. But if you think of anything physical that you go to tap into something spiritual, that essentially is what witchcraft is. You're going to, whether it's a wizard's wand, whether it's a hat, or whether it's, some incantation book, trying to say words or whatever. All of that stuff is going through rituals or physical items to attain something spiritual. And if you go back to Genesis 3 again, not only did Satan put doubt in Eve's mind, not only did he manipulate God's word, distort God's word to motivate her, but also she saw that the fruit was there to make her wise, right? So not only did the fruit look good, not only did she want it to taste good, but also it was there to make her wise. Now, I've asked my students often, how in the world does a fruit make you wise? Wisdom is something spiritual. So anytime somebody goes to something physical to attain something spiritual is essentially the general definition of witchcraft. And so in Pokemon, you've got a lot of interesting connections between not only physical things, but technological things. And this is something that Carl Teichrieb and Kyle and I talked about, was the idea of technology, deception, and occultism. There's a huge connection there that we're not going to get into, but there is just such a love for what Kyle was reading there in Isaiah, I think it was 44, about the idea of worshiping the works of your hands. Because technology comes from man's hands and man's designs, there is this very clear attraction between technology and mysticism. It just is. So in Pokemon, they do a good job of mixing the two. So you've got this technological advancement of the Pokeball that somehow, mystically, magically, or technologically can capture these creatures that are just around the world. So you've got this idea that you can use something physical like a Pokeball to capture these creatures, and that you're doing these different rituals and different things to attain that knowledge and attain that power is all part of what fits into witchcraft. Now, the other piece to that puzzle is if you look at all of the different elements that Pokemon deals with, and there's a list of them that we'll hopefully have up, and it's dealing with all the different ways that you categorize Pokemon. And there's things like ice and metal and grass and earth and water. You notice it's all physical created items. Now they do get into things like ghost and dark and I think there's psychic, and there's a whole bunch. I think there's like 16 different categories for these Pokemon. Some Pokemon have more than one category to each of them, but oftentimes it's physical. And when you read in like Romans 1, they exchange the creator for creation. They exchange the truth for the lie. So in witchcraft, you're always going to the elements. You're always going, and Disney's great at this, that they just had that movie that came out with dealing with the elements. So all of that is dealing with witchcraft. And if you notice on some of their cards, on many of the cards, there's a little icon in the corner, and it'll have a little icon of fire, or a little icon of water, or a little icon of grass, or a little icon of earth, or a little icon of rock or clay or metal. All of that indicates what kind of card it is and what the category of that Pokemon is. But it's either strangely mystical, unbiblically mystical, or it's creation itself. And that's what they focus on. And you'll notice in the original video that we referenced of the origin story, the reason we did 2 minutes of that was to help people see all these creatures were like rock creatures, metal creatures, or many of them anywhere were elemental, and they were used then to create everything. So that's essentially the dangers, I think, with witchcraft is, all these different elements, the rituals, and the technology connections. And if we could at this time, Kyle, I don't know if you would be able to pull it up. Could you pull up for me 2 Chronicles 33, verse 6, and go ahead and read that for us?
2 Chronicles 33, verse 6, it says, "And he caused his children to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. Also he observed times and used enchantments and used witchcraft and dealt with a familiar spirit. And with wizards he wrought much evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger."
Yep. So you've got people in the Old Testament, Kyle brought this up earlier, about Israel over and over being warned against not becoming like the nations around her. And because of Israel's fornication with other gods, that is really why Israel got sent away. They were not obedient to God. And you'll notice even with like, David, not so much, but Solomon, absolutely. The sad thing with Solomon was not only did he marry so many women, but he became a bit quite a bit strayed by their false doctrines, their false gods. And so we see this over and over and over throughout time. And we do not live in a culture that is devoid from that danger. And as Christians, I think if anything, we are more susceptible to it because of our technology, we have access to things so quickly that people didn't before. We have access to just every kind of delusion and deception out there so quickly at such a young age. And somehow we just don't think about it, I guess. But so we actually have it, I think, worse off. Another one I was thinking about is Galatians chapter 5, Kyle, if you wouldn't, if we could pull that up, 5:19.
Yep. Galatians 5:19 says, "Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lavishness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of which I tell you before, as I have also told you in times past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God."
Now, and that's a heartbreaking list. And what's interesting is right in the middle of that entire list, you've got all these things like physical things, fornication and adulteries and anger and seditions. And no Christian would say that those are good things. But right in the middle of that list, or almost in the middle of that list, there's this one that is spiritual witchcraft. And it's interesting that you've got all these physical things that the Bible is warning against, the lust of the flesh and the dangers of the flesh, or all these physical things. And then you've got witchcraft just kind of like oddly put right in the middle of them, reminding us, I think, that we, by human nature, are drawn to worship creation. By human nature, we're drawn to attain power or want to attain power. And again, the Pokemon is exactly where that comes from. All of that is right what we're finding. So not only are we considering the cultic aspects, the occultic patterns, not only are we considering its history, not only are we considering sort of the backstory, we're considering the shamanism, we're considering all of these areas, but we're also considering the witchcraft that is brought about through an animistic culture. And all of this goes back to, Genesis 3, Satan promising Eve that she could become like God, knowing good and evil, instead of knowing God. So this is what happens even in a Christian culture. You want to know all these things instead of God. So that is such a dangerous area. The last of the points to consider, and this one is going to feel a bit like redundancy in a sense, and I purposely want to do this. So thank you for bearing with us, because if you've gotten stuck with us this far, you might be thinking, okay, yeah, you've got a case for the influence of Shintoism, you've got a case for all these things, influence of animism and all that, but Pikachu. I mean, this cute little cuddly creature, you've got all this Squirtle and all these other little just, they look like Jigglypuff and all this stuff. And you've got things that look like they could just be a pillow. And there are plenty of marketing, things that have come out that are pillows and plushies and shirts. They look cute. They just look cute and marketable like anything else. But here's the thing. Just like anything else with Satan, oftentimes he snags us by giving us something cute and cuddly. But when it comes right down to it, it is not cute and cuddly. So as things go on in the New Age, often in New Age, everything's nice and beautiful and wonderful. But, it says that referring to the Antichrist in Daniel, he will deceive them wonderfully. So there is this idea that Satan loves to give us wonderful things, beautiful things to deceive us, and sometimes cute and cuddly things. So just because it's cute and cuddly doesn't mean it's not dangerous. I mean, some of the most beautiful fish in the ocean, you'd want to just go up and touch them, but if you touch them, man, they hurt. So the number 5 is I titled it "The Devil's in the Details," because I'm going to go through just a handful. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's over 1,000 Pokemon. Now, you can order books on, basically it's called a Pokédex, which in the show, it's a wristwatch or a wrist thing, or maybe like a handheld device that keeps track of all of the information about all the Pokemon. Now, how they know all of it, some of these things you wonder, how do they know all of it? How do they program that thing to know all of it? I don't know. But they have a Pokédex that keeps track of all the backstories of all the Pokemon. And they intentionally, when they produce these books, because I've got one on order, it's not here yet, that goes through the first 800 of them. And it'll give you all the backstories, all the levels, everything else. There's just so much to them. But on the cover, you always see the cute and cuddly ones. As you go through the book, it gets into some really nasty stuff. And some of these I didn't realize until I was doing the research recently. Some of these have given kids extreme terror and nightmare situations because of how dark they really are. And this is where we have to be careful of the darkness that is in Pokemon. So I'm going to go through just a couple of them, or a handful of them, and I'm going to read a couple from a website that we're going to link below. But so just stick with us. If you've already stuck with us this far, I want you to understand these are specific Pokemon that are supposedly just fantasy. But listen to this. This is one called Delphox, the fire psychic Pokemon. And then the person I pulled this information from wrote this. Its name has 2 parts, which in combo is the Oracle of Delphi and Fox. However, before I found that info, I used thesaurus.com. This is from a site I found, and they were saying this, a Christian site. By the way, it's hard to find Christian sites with any good information about Pokemon. But to find synonyms for psychic, occult, witch, etc. Under occult, I noticed Delphian and Delphic. So Delphian is a word that connects with the occult, or Delphic. Delphic means occultism. I wondered if any Pokemon had a similar name to this, and sure enough, there was the mystical Delphox. In other words, occultic fox. Looking up Delphox on Pokemon.wikia.com, I found that this was a fox with the elements of a witch or a mage. My Pokemon handbook further said that it held a flaming branch in its hand upon which it focused its eyes, giving it psychic vision, helping it to see into the future. After reading about the Oracle of Delphi, Delphox's story became even clearer. This then can be woven into Acts chapter 16 story involving the Oracle of Delphi. Related topics in this occult area include occultic, Delphic, witch, wizard, mage, focus, psychic visions, oracles of Delphi, or Oracle of Delphi, Apollo, spirit of divination, in Acts 16. So this creature, this fox, this Delphox, has basically, and you can look at it, I mean, it looks like a witch. I mean, from the hat to the staff and everything else. And that's just one of many. I'm going to read another one. Drifloon, this is another Pokemon. This ghost flying type from Generation 4 may look like a balloon, but helium isn't what keeps it afloat. Drifloon's body, so you can see it there, it's looks kind of like it's floating. Drifloon's body is stuffed with the souls of humans, and Pokemon, it is ferrying to the afterlife, earning it the nickname Signpost for Wandering Souls. It's often targeting children, tugging at their hands to try and drag them to the afterlife. Children who mistake this Pokemon for a balloon and hold its hand have been known to vanish. I mean, now, you look at that little creature, it looks cute and cuddly, and what could be any harm to it? It's the stories behind them that these kids are learning, and I'll guarantee there are kids that study these things harder than they studied in their classroom. Another one I have is Banette, Banettete. Every kid has a favorite toy when they outgrew at some point. Now imagine if that toy came to life, fueled by its hatred after being cast off to haunt you. That's Banette, an abandoned doll turned Pokemon with a serious grudge. Now, first of all, how does an abandoned doll become a Pokemon? Some of the story is really interesting how the physical taps into the spiritual here. But abandoned doll turned Pokemon with a serious grudge, sort of a cross between Annabelle and a voodoo doll. It generates energy for laying strong curses by sticking pins into its own body. Its mouth is zipped up to keep all that cursed energy from escaping. It haunts dark alleyways seeking the child who disowned it to enact revenge, according to multiple Pokédex entries. After learning about Banette's fate, this person writes, this is from a Pokemon site, I'll never look at Toy Story the same way again. There's another one. I'm going to read a handful of these, and I'm going to do this on purpose because I want you to understand it's not just a few. Frostlass is an ice ghost. So Frostlass. Frostlass is an ice ghost type, one of the rarest combinations in the Pokemon games. It's appropriate too. Her Pokedex entries, these are the information. Pokedex is basically like a giant dictionary for Pokemon. But the Pokedex entries will unquestionably chill you to the bone. Perhaps the most upsetting description is the one in Pokemon Sun, which is one of the information. They gather information about the Pokemon through the video games. That's what they're gathering these through. So you learn more about them as you play the games and stuff. So in Pokemon Sun, when it finds humans or Pokemon it likes, it freezes them and takes them to its chilly den where they become decorations. Now, I mean, at that point, I could stop and say, is this something I want my children to practice? Is this a ritual? Am I willing to spend money on this for my children? This sounds the thing of just absolute deception and darkness. That alone, and I'm going to keep going just to prove the point. So the next one I have is Gengar. Gengar poses as your shadow. Gengar. Gengar poses as your shadow and then curses you and steals your life. My favorite summation of this comes in Pokemon Sun's Pokedex entry. This is somebody who's writing these. I pulled it from a reputable Pokemon site, which feels like it may have been written by Gengar itself. Should you feel yourself, this is what it actually says in Pokemon Sun. Gengar says, should you feel yourself attacked by a sudden chill, it is evidence of an approaching Gengar. There is no escaping it, just give up. Then the next ones I have, this one is actually called Phantump and Trevenant. So it's Phantump. That's one version of it. And then the next one is Trevenant, Trevenant. So if you can't find those, that's fine. You got them there. So it says this: the story behind the Phantom and Trevenant evolution family as a whole is just terrifying. Phantoms are rotten tree stumps possessed by the spirits of lost children who died in the forest. Now notice how there's spirits into the Pokemon. They're not just spirits that have always been here. Do you see how this works? So you have this physical item that is now possessed by spirits of children, and then that becomes the Pokemon. So they're not just magical, mystical creatures that have always been here. Does this sound like animism? Does this sound like Shintoism? Yes. Phantoms are rotten tree stumps possessed by the spirits of lost children who died in the forest. Their cries sound like eerie screams, and they can mimic the voice of a child. According to its Pokemon Ultra Sun Pokedex entry, these Pokemon use this trick to make friends, luring travelers further into the woods until they become hopelessly lost, presumably so that once they die, their spirits can become new phantoms. And I'm going to pull up a couple there was an excellent site that I came across, and we actually link it in our original and I think it's called like Discerning Granny. And I thought it was just, first of all, I love the name. But let me make sure that's what it was. I'm going to have to scroll up because it was a long article. Learn to Discern Granny. That was it. Learn to Discern Granny. But she goes through on this article, and we'll link it, some of the dangerous ones. But I'm going to read, this one is a psychic. It's called Drowsy, Drowzee. And it's a hypnosis or hypnotic Pokemon. Drowsy lurks near to draw out dreams. Drowsy is a dream eater, which is actually something in a lot of different animistic cultures, dream catchers, dream eaters. These are actually held to in Japanese culture, if you're having nightmares, to have these kind of like shamanistic or ritualistic kind of tokens that can help get rid of your like good luck charms to help you get rid of your bad dreams. But Drowsy, a dream eater, uses moves that include hypnosis, meditation, a Zen headbutt, psychic, psi beam, poison gas, psi shock, and future sight, plus more. Hypno is another. Now, a lot of that stuff is actually what people actually believe in. The psychic, future sight, and other things. That's actually, there's a whole section of Pokemon that are third eye Pokemon. And if you know anything about occultism and New Age, that's big. There's a psychic Pokemon called Hypno, Hypno, and it's a hypnosis Pokemon. Hypno uses a pendulum for putting one into a hypnotic trance. Hypno, too, is able to sense what its victim is dreaming. So it says a movie, Hypno's Nap Time, tells how Hypno's sleep waves have caused children to disappear and Pokemon to grow sleepy. Alakazam. And Alakazam is a psychic type Pokemon. And Alakazam actually has what's called a mega evolutionary stage. And so I'm going to read just part of the description I found in one site for actually a Pokedex site. And it says, while it has strong psychic abilities and high intelligence, and Alakazam's muscles are very weak, it uses psychic power to move its body. Its superb memory lets it recall everything it has experienced from birth. Its IQ exceeds 5,000. Its highly developed brain is on par with a supercomputer. It can use all forms of psychic abilities. The spoons that it clutches in its hand are said to have been created by psychic power. Closing both of its eyes heightens all of its other senses. This enables it to use its abilities to their extremes. And I mean, now children aren't just learning about these things, these Pokemon, they're learning all kinds of crazy, crazy things about them. So like, yeah, like this one is just, you see the two spoons, but now the other image that I have when it's in its mega, it's Alakazam or Mega Alakazam. If you type that in, you'll see it sits there in a psychic pose, and you'll see it right there. That's a Pokemon. This is one of the cards your child can buy. This is one of the creatures that your child can learn about. And you notice it's got a third eye. A lot of these Pokemon, when they evolve, will get this ability to have a third eye. Not a lot of them, but some of them. So, and there, it just, the list goes on and on. We already talked, I think, about Gengar, perhaps, but the Mega Gengar, if you want to type in Mega Gengar, Gengar, you'll see there's the third eye again. Gengar has a Mega Evolution available in Generation 6 games. Now, again, this is right from Pokemon site or a Pokemon Pokedex site. It also has a Gigantamax form. And it says here, Gengar's relationships are warped. It has no interest in opponents unless it perceives them as prey. The energy of Mega Evolution awakened it. It sinks into another dimension where it keeps a patient watch for its chance to attack. It tries to take the lives of everyone and anyone. It will even try to curse the trainer who is its master. Mega Evolution has made it possible for Gengar to access other dimensions. Its entire body is brimming with strange power. It can pass through other dimensions and can appear anywhere. It caused a stir one time when it stuck just one leg out of a wall. So, I mean, I can go on and on. And if you like this book that I've ordered, this is right from a Pokemon site. Kids can go on to Scholastic, right? A lot of schools have Scholastic book fairs and buy books for $20 that give you 1,000 different Pokemon, and this is what they're reading. And if you don't believe it, go find your kid's book if your kid's into Pokemon, and they will have books giving descriptions like this, or ask your kid to talk about them, and you will hear these stories. They know them inside and out. Problem is, we don't know them as grown-ups or as youth pastors or as leaders. And so we just look at it as, oh, well, like if you pull up a picture of Pikachu, it looks all just cute and cuddly and fun. And why are you guys such against all this just, cute stuff? Well, this is why, because it starts there. It doesn't end there. The Hypno one that we talked about earlier, it says when it locks its eyes with an enemy, it will use a mix of psi, which is psychic energy, and it will move such as hypnosis and confusion. And it says avoid eye contact if you come across one. It will try to put you to sleep by using its pendulum. When it is very hungry, it puts humans it meets to sleep, and then it feasts on their dreams. Now, come on. Always holding a pendulum that it rocks steadily into a rhythm, it causes drowsiness. Now, hypnosis is actually forbidden. I mean, that's an easy way to tap into the occult. And it just keeps going on and on and on. I mean, I could just sit and read over and over. There's another one. I don't know if I'll pronounce this right, but it's Runerigus, Runerigus, Runerigus. And it says Runerigus is a ground ghost type Pokemon. There you go. It has a powerful curse that was woven into an ancient painting. After absorbing the spirit of a Yamask, the painting began to move. Again, we have a physical item being absorbed by a spiritual item, and that now is a Pokemon. So what your kids are actually playing are spirit-infested items. Never touch its shadow-like body, or you'll be shown the horrific memories behind the picture carved into it. Now, again, it just goes on and on. You'll notice the one with the 4 hands. That's another nasty one. There with the mummy with the sarcophagus. That's another one. I'm not going to read that one, but Another one, I'm just going to wrap it up. I think we already read on this one. So let me go with this one. Darkrai, Darkrai. Darkrai. Darkrai is a dark type Pokemon introduced in Generation 4. And so Darkrai, it can lull people to sleep and make them dream. It is active during the nights of a new moon. The folklore is that on the moonless nights, this Pokemon will make people see horrific nightmares. To protect itself, it afflicts those around it with nightmares. However, it means no harm. Okay, so I hope that I've at least made my point that not all of this is cute and cuddly. You look at some of this stuff. Now, some of it is designed by fan art. Some of these cards, some of them are made by other sources, but the official Pokemon, there are over 1,000 of them. Ask your child or just go online. There are Pokédexes. That's all I did, was went to an official site and pulled up a lot of backstories. So when we say the devil is in the details, you better believe it. He's in the details. And in this case, we're going to apply that to, if you look at the details of what Pokemon is really all about, the backstories, the details of all these Pokemon, the devil is in it. The devil is in all these details of the backstories of so many of them. And kids are being introduced to this, and they're spending so much time on it. And we could sit and talk about, I mean, I could just read more and more and more. I have so many different Pokemon. I don't want to keep going on about it because that's where I got disgusted when I started reading some of this, Kyle. I didn't feel good. I can't imagine handing this to kids and saying, here. And, it doesn't start that way. They start with just, it's fun. It's interesting. It's a new world. I'm learning all this new information. My friends are playing it. But then over time, you learn a little bit more. Some of it's dark. Your conscience is kind of checking you a little bit. Your spirit's like, I don't know. Kids probably get freaked out. They get the nightmares about it, but that's okay because that's part of the way it goes. Now in the new age, it's the same pattern. Once you get into the new age, you get excited about it because it's this new world. You're opening all these weird doors. Some of it's kind of scary, but you kind of hold on to the good stuff. And if you hear anybody's testimony who has left the new age, they will tell you the exact same story as what we're putting our kids through to learn all of this weird psychic, mystical, spirit-infested garbage that's just absolutely forbidden in Scripture. So I hope that by doing this, by taking a couple hours, I feel like I'm almost losing my voice at this point. But by talking about all this, I hope that we can at least make the case for this is something more than a game. This is not about just an emotional, nostalgic conviction that you might have to something you played as a kid. When you're a kid, you don't know better. I look at the games and things I did as a kid. I did not know that the movies I was watching and the garbage that I was playing was infested with spiritual wickedness. I just didn't know. And nobody told me because they didn't know. I didn't come from a Christian family, but even Christian families often don't know. So it behooves us now that we know this to share it. And that's where, Pokemon is growing and it is going. And I didn't want to, hijack what we say, but it is the pattern, right? Satan isn't just sitting around either. He's growing and going. And it is our job to do the same, but in the God's truth. As parents, we might think that we understand what our kids are going through, or we might understand what kids are actually, what they're learning in these games. But clearly, they're teaching things that are ungodly. And our responsibility as parents, pastors, teachers, is to train our kids in the ways they should go, not let the world train them in the ways that they are forbidden by God. So that's where I'm at, and that's where we're at as a ministry. So I guess I'll just stop it there. Kyle, you tell me what your thoughts are.
So as what I hear you saying, Flynn, is really like, to me, it encapsulates the idea of a sanctification process. As believers, what we're trying to understand is God's calling us out of the world. And when we see, like Genesis to Revelation, we see God's faithfulness of continually calling his children to stand ye and walk and separate. And he's calling us to do that, but there's an obedience of us acknowledging him who separates us, who gives us a new heart, a heart of flesh. We're born again and we see what he's done, and then he calls us to then walk and stand. So as you're talking about some of these things, a lot of us, whether parents or children or grown adults that are still struggling with these things or are entertaining the idea that this is just entertainment, remember the calling of what God calls his people to do. It's to continually walk and follow him. Jesus said to come and follow me, and it took Peter to actually drop his nets. God didn't come in and take his nets out of his hand and tell Peter to drop them. Peter had to actually obey and say, I'm no longer a fisherman of fish. I'm a fisherman. And God called him to do that. And Peter was faithful to do so. Now he struggled even to the point where Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. But that's because he looked with his worldly eyes. And that's what I think when I hear these things, we do as creatures in this world continually fall back to the flesh, but God calls us to be sanctified and to look forward at what the redemption is. So I'm going to read Romans 8 because I've been chewing on that in my own private time. In Romans 8, verse 20, it says, for the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by the reason of him who had subjected the same hope, because the creature itself also shall be delivered unto the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now. Not only they, but ourselves also have which the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for what? For the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our bodies. For we are saved by hope, but hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man sees, why does he yet hope for? But if we hope for that which is we see not, then do we have patience waiting for it. So we are longing for the redemption of our bodies. And how can we say that if we're entertaining these things that are in opposition to God? And so as we're learning and growing, like you said, growing and going, in order to understand how to go and follow Jesus, we got to grow. And that means challenging ourselves, allowing the word of God to challenge us. And we should be groaning inside. We shouldn't be fighting or resisting God's word. As believers, we should be grateful for the testimony of truth that actually challenges our innermost beings. And everyone's different. When we're talking about Pokémon or drinking alcohol or smoking cigars and all these things that are like in and of themselves not evil, like Paul tries to talk about in Romans 4, he's like, get out of this stuff. Now, this Pokemon is outright evil. But even those that try and entertain it as just a game, like Flynn said, acknowledge it, be sanctified and called out of it, and walk in obedience, because the Bible does call us to do that. And you will be blessed by that. Your life will flourish, like we read in Matthew 5. Blessed are ye that are persecuted for my name's sake. They're persecuted because of God's holiness, not because of them trying to just be anti-Pokemon people. Like, stand ye fast and be a believer that follows Christ, and let these things just fall off in your life. And whether it's Pokemon or whatever it is, that's what our encouragement is for this video.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really hope, our heart is that we've given you enough information to really challenge you in this particular area. But this particular area can be applied to anything in our lives. Be careful of steering your hearts and minds toward what you watch on TV, toward your lifestyle, toward what you're spending your money on. I think it was Spurgeon who said one of the last things to be sanctified is our pocketbooks. And that's that's a challenge for all of us, no matter what the area. But this one, and I think we've built a pretty strong case for it, is huge, and it is infecting and affecting this next generation. And this next generation, if the Lord tarries, is going to grow up and be our next youth pastors, our next ministers, our next godly dads and godly moms. And we want them to not be caught up with their nets. I like that the connection you made there. Jesus called Peter to let go of those nets. And there are things in our lives that Satan has laid out as traps that we tend to get caught up in, and we simply just need to let them go. And for that person who maybe says, hey, it's no big deal, I can always reverse that argument and just say, well, if it is no big deal, why not let it go? So, and if you're saying, no, I need to hang on to it. Well, you just said it was no big deal. If it's no big deal, then why not set it down for a month? If you're involved in something like this, magic, or maybe it's Dungeons and Dragons or role play, or even video games, man, I'll tell you, just take some time and step away from the things that are consuming us and just spend time with the Lord. And that's our encouragement. Yeah, one of the first scriptures I want to read, we're going to read a handful of scriptures at this point just to encourage those that are watching and listening. And we're going to wrap it up at that point. If you want to go, I would encourage people re-listening to the information we have here. Check out the links below. We're going to have links to several articles and at least 1 or 2 books that people can look at if they want to know more about this subject. Or you can always reach out to us through our website or through here, and we'll get in contact with you to give you some good information on it. And be praying. Please be in prayer over these things. These are spiritual at their core, so they are worth praying about. But first scripture that I'm going to go to, I referenced it a few times, is Deuteronomy chapter 6. And we're going to read starting in verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel," this is called the Shema, because here is Shema in Hebrew. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words," verse 6, "which I command you this day shall be in your heart. And you shall teach them diligently unto your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them for a sign upon your hand, and they shall be frontlets between your eyes." And verse 9 says, and you shall write them upon the posts of your house and upon your gates." In other words, everywhere we go, everything we do should be pointing both people and our children to the truth of God and who he is and his word. So that is something we've talked a lot about today. The next verse I want to get to is in the New Testament, and it's in 1 Thessalonians. I'm going to read the verse 5, and then I'm going to go down to verse 22. So again, this idea, verse 5. So it says this: "You are all children of the light," or children of light, "and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness." And the first part of verse 6 says, "Therefore, let us not sleep as others do." Well, actually, I'm going to read the whole thing. "But let us watch and be sober." Sober-minded is what it means. So careful thinkers, not walking in darkness, but walking in light. Verse 22 says, this is a good one, I think, for us when we have that conviction issue of our conviction argument, which is usually an emotional argument. But 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 22 says, "Abstain from all appearance of evil." So I would say, if you don't think Pokemon is evil, it certainly has the appearance of evil. And here it says, "Abstain from all appearance of evil." And the last one that I have, and then I know Kyle was going to jump in on a couple, but it says, I'm going to go to 1 John, so a little bit later in the Bible, right toward the end by Revelation. It says 1 John in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. It says, "If we say that we have fellowship with him," meaning the Lord, "and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. But if you walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his son, cleanses us from all sin." So that's our encouragement, is walk in the light, walk in the Spirit of God, and we will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. We won't end up in walking in darkness. So that's our encouragement.
Yep. And I think the best way to wrap this video up, through all these scriptures, as we think about this, to really rest in not only what God calls us from, but what he calls us to. He calls us to his son. And so as we chew on the last few portions of this, we as a ministry strongly encourage you to deep dive in Ephesians 4. I'm going to start in verse 17, but it's also applicable, and it's going to be a big chunk here. But I hope that this is the encouragement of not just talking about dark things, but explaining our call as Christians to walk and follow Christ. So Ephesians 4, starting in 17, it says, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over unto lavishness, to work all uncleanness with greediness. But you have not so learned Christ. If so be that you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that ye put off concerning the former conversations the old man, which is corrupt according to the deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, that you put on the new man, which after God is created in righteousness and true holiness. Wherefore, putting away lying, speak every man truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be ye angry, and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath, neither give place to the devil. Let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needs. Let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good, to use that of edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. And grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby you are sealed unto the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. And be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you." That's our encouragement at Once Lost, not only to be called away and remember where we once were, but to be called to the transforming and renewing of our mind to Jesus Christ, who is the only one who sets us apart from this world. So be encouraged that he is calling you out of these things. Be ye separate and love him. It's a joyful thing. Thank you for joining us.
Amen.